The following isn't my own story, it's actually my father's. So my father worked as a fire lookout worker. Basically it meant that he spent a lot of time up in the fire towers, usually by himself, and he would have to patrol every so often around where his tower was, make sure no one was doing anything wrong, and mostly just keep an eye out for any fires. Now he'd done this job for a long time. He had a career that was at least 5 years long in this. He did other things too, but he said this was his absolute favourite thing in the world to do. He loved it when he could look around and not see anyone for miles. For myself, I think I'd get a lot more bored of this, but I guess back then it was more fun, because there wasn't as much to do, I suppose. Now my dad said that sometimes he would communicate with other workers in nearby fire towers with their radios. This was his most favourite thing to do because it could get lonely up there sometimes. He had a buddy, Ryan, who he would regularly communicate with. They would often work similar shifts, and they would actually go out drinking with each other sometimes when they weren't working, of course. Now in my dad's job, some nights he would have to stay up in the tower for quite a few days on his own. Again, this is something he had no problem with. However, he did have 2 or 3 scary stories that I'd like to share with you all. Now the first was on one particular evening. My dad says that it was extremely cold. He doesn't know why, it was just almost like the atmosphere was thicker, like when there's fog everywhere, but at the time there wasn't any. He said because of this, he had a very big heavy winter coat on, but he was also having issues with connecting to the radio correctly. Apparently there was some kind of moisture in the air, which meant the electronics, which were more simple back then, weren't working very well. So anyway, there's nothing much for my dad to see, and he decides to lay in his bed for a few minutes just to rest his back. At the time he was doing some drawings and needed to rest his eyes too. He did notice something rather odd though. He could see a light off in the distance. Now of course he grabs his binoculars and has to make sure there's no fire. As he does this, he realizes that he can't actually focus on whatever this is. It's a red colour like a burning ember, but there's no smoke, and it doesn't seem to be spreading. It doesn't seem to be too big too. My dad decides that he better go and investigate it, so grabs his coat and heads down. As he heads down, he realizes just how cold it is. He's annoyed because he has to leave his warm tower station and he can't be bothered to walk that far, but he has to do it because of course this is a part of his job. He realizes as soon as he gets down that he can't actually see where the fire or light is coming from. Of course this is a little bit concerning for my father because there could be a much bigger fire and maybe smoke's concealing it. But then again, surely he would have seen something by now. So as he heads off in the direction where he saw the light coming from, he gets a strange feeling that he's being watched that he just can't shake. He doesn't let this deter him, however, and he continues towards where the light is supposed to be. He wonders now if maybe his mind was playing tricks on him and it was where his eyes were strained, because he's walked out to nearly exactly where the fire or torch was and he literally can't see a thing. He takes a while to look around and just smell if there's anything burning. He can't smell a thing, and he realizes that he's come a long way from the tower now. Clearly there's nothing too pressing. My dad then decides to turn back. Just as he's walking away, he can hear a strange chanting sound in the distance, almost like somebody singing but more rhythmic. My dad says that it only lasts for 1 single second, but he's pretty sure he heard it. It could always be an illusion of his imagination, but he said it sounded too real. He's a little concerned now and decides to head back. While he's doing so, he's convincing himself that this is all in his mind and there's nothing to be worried about, and he heads back to the fire station. When he gets up to the fire station, he realizes something really odd. Now, there's not only one torch, exactly where my dad's just come from, but there's multiple, and they're all about exactly the same height. My dad then gets his binoculars and still can't differentiate exactly what he's seeing. He goes to radio it in to his buddy Ryan, but he can't get any signal because of the electronics playing up. He realises this is quite a big issue now, because if there is actually a fire, he's not going to be able to let anyone know, and he'll have to quickly get into the truck and go over to the next station where Ryan is and let him know. Now, my dad's growing quite concerned at this point. He decides to step outside of the actual cabin windows of the fire tower for a closer look with the binoculars. As he does so, he realises that something's off now. He can actually see clearly because the glass isn't distorting his view of whatever this is, and he notices that whatever this is seems to be holding up a torch. He can't make out exactly what it is because it's entirely black, but my dad realises that there's at least 5 of these things now, all moving around very slowly with the torches. That's when it hits him. He held his breath for just a second, and he can hear the chanting again. Again, very rhythmic, but multiple now. My dad soon realises that something's very wrong. What's worse is he has some of his lights on, and of course they're not going to know exactly where he is. So he quickly goes back inside and hits the light. He needs to be quiet, and he needs to not be seen for this moment. My dad lays down trying to figure out exactly what to do just outside of the cabin near the stairs. He quickly looks down, and thankfully there's none of them figures coming towards him. At first he thinks maybe there were some kids playing pranks on him, but why on earth would they be out here at this time, this far away from everything, where you can only get in trouble? He then sees 2 or 3 more lights appear, and eventually he realises that there's 10 of these figures holding up the torches, and every so often he'll hear the chanting sound. Then, just as soon as it arrives, it fades out into the distance. My dad decides to be brave and hold his ground for as long as he possibly can, but he understands that he's now in a situation that maybe he can't deal with. "Ryan! Ryan!" he screams onto the radio, but doesn't get a response. All he can hear is static. My dad doesn't have any weapons with him, and he's now concerned for his life. Just how many of these things are there out here, and what do they want? He very hesitantly takes the first step towards his truck, but he realises that he hasn't checked down the stairs. Maybe, just maybe, he's safer up the fire tower. But then again, what if they set fire to this with the torches, whatever they are? He remains there for what feels like an eternity, but says was probably only another 5 minutes. To his horror, he realises that these figures are actually getting closer to him and his fire tower. He has no choice now but to go down. He's fighting with every step the urge to immediately run back up and just scream and lock himself in the top, but he knows he can't do it. He takes some very slow steps down, hoping not to be heard, but soon realises that these things are picking up pace. He bolts down all of the stairs in what must have been record time, and he just makes it towards his truck. Just as he gets in the truck, he realises that he doesn't have his keys with him and he has to go back up. He was so scared that he literally couldn't think straight. He then starts bolting it up the stairs again, and he luckily finds the keys. He's too scared to actually look up as to how close these things have got to him, and he just runs all the way back down. The moment he steps foot onto the ground again, he can hear them much closer this time, making a whispering sound. The torches have gone out, but he can actually figure out where they are by the sounds, and from what my dad told me, it couldn't have been more than 20 meters away. He quickly gets into the truck and drives as quick as he possibly can over to Ryan. He doesn't look behind him as he's peeling away, and he can hear something getting closer to him in the tree line as he's pulling away. He was too scared to even look to the side to figure out exactly what it could be. Again, in record time, he makes it over to the other fire tower, where his friend Ryan's angry at him for not answering any of the radio calls. He then explains exactly what happened and Ryan goes pale as a ghost. Ryan explains that he too has spotted them before, but he was too scared to tell anyone in case they didn't believe him or thought he was going crazy. They ended up calling it into the station and they launched an investigation to find out exactly what was out there. Unfortunately, they needed my dad and Ryan to be part of that, but they both agreed it was okay if they did most of it in the truck and let the other rangers take over and figure out what was going on. After hours of investigating, nobody could find anything. Luckily, another worker took over the tower for that day, and my dad still gets chills when he talks about it. He doesn't know exactly who or what it was out there, but the thing that scares him most is whatever these things were, they move far too quick to be human. He said it could just be because of the adrenaline and panic setting in, but he's honestly never seen anything like it. Another one of my father's stories is when he was working in the towers during one summer's evening. He said he kept on hearing suspicious noises around where he was set up during the day, and he thought it was just animals. He didn't know exactly what animal it was, but something kept on climbing up the steps, chewing part of the steps away, then running off with whatever food it could on the stairs or left around. My dad said he didn't mind and actually encouraged it, thinking it was probably a cute squirrel or something, leaving peanuts and whatnot. My dad always made sure that he didn't leave them too high up in case the thing fell, but he said he realised that in previous days, the trailings were getting progressively closer to where he was sleeping, and he thought it was pretty odd because one morning last week he had woken up to see some peanuts crunched on the floor right outside of the window where he was sleeping. After that he decided to not do it anymore. So anyway, my dad kept on hearing noises but thought it was probably nothing, and just continued on with the rest of his shift. He was periodically checking around and reading and listening to the radio. It eventually comes to the next morning, and this is a very cold day in particular. My dad says that what he saw next is one of the most scary things that he ever saw in his life. He goes to open the door and there's frost on all of the windows. Just as he does that, he can clearly see handprints outside of the door at human height. Also, he steps out to find a note saying, "Why no peanuts?" Of course my dad reported it, and they did some investigations but couldn't really find anything. They tried to tell him that it was kids playing a prank on him or maybe just a homeless person, but why would a homeless person be out there in the woods? And what kind of people would play a prank like that on my dad, where clearly they were going to get arrested for it and could get in big trouble or really hurt? My dad also doesn't understand how they got up the station so quietly. After this experience, my dad said that he always made sure the door was locked, and that he would never ever leave food out again, for animals or anything. My dad's final story isn't his own one, but actually his friend Ryan. Now you may recall me talking about Ryan in the first story. So basically, Ryan was stationed in another tower pretty close to my dad's, but you'd have to drive to get there in any kind of decent time. Now, on one particular summer, my dad's friend Ryan realised that there was a fire, or at least the embers from one, and he has to go and investigate quickly. He radios it in, and he quickly goes down to get into his truck to try and drive over there and see how bad it is. He eventually gets to the source of the fire and realises that it's a huge blazing inferno. He couldn't see it too well because it was over a hill line, but he's very scared that this is going to spread badly, so he quickly tries to radio it in, but he can't get any signal on the walkie-talkie. He speeds in his truck to get back to his own fire tower, but he realises there's lots of smoke ahead. He rolls up the windows so he can continue breathing half-decent air, and just as he does so, he slams the truck to a halt. Up ahead he can see his very own tower on fire, and the trees around it burning. He quickly drives off in the opposite direction to my dad's tower, and they call it in. Turns out there's an absolutely huge inferno, and it takes days for them to put out the fire. Luckily nobody was hurt from this, and they just think it occurred naturally. But one terrifying detail for Ryan is that his fire tower had collapsed due to the blaze, and had he have not left about 20 minutes sooner, fell asleep or anything, he would have died in the fire tower. I'd worked in the fire towers for a long time, and I wasn't really scared of much, but there was one particular thing that I can never forget and still is kind of glued into my mind. So, on one particular area that we would go to, we would have lots of reports of a strange man with a backpack sprinting through the forest. We were sure he was homeless. That was until we realised from some of the other fire tower workers that this exact thing had been reported for over 50 years there. They even given him a nickname, the Cheetah, because he doesn't stop running. Now what's pretty scary about this is no one's ever seen his face or can actually confirm exactly what the hell it is. I did have a few times that I was stationed at night and I would actually hear some sounds rushing through the trees. I was convinced it was a bear, so I'd quickly go and get my mace, but every single time I went down, I would just capture the glimpse of something running off that was too small to be a bear, but big enough to be a person, and nothing more. I was convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but who knows. Well, I guess I found out one particular evening. Now, I pretty much let it fall into the depths of my mind and presumed that this was just my mind playing tricks on me because hey, I can remember a time that I was stationed out here before where I'd driven up to my tower one day and I could see my tower on fire. I quickly turned around to see if there was any other signs of smoke, looked back, and it was completely fine. It turned out that my mind had started playing tricks on me because I'd been on my own for so long, and I managed to get sent home for a few days to recover. But anyway, on this one particular evening, some other guys had radioed in that they had reports of somebody running through the forest. I assumed it was a homeless person or a lost hiker and was pretty worried, so I decided to investigate from the top of my tower. I have my binoculars out and I'm looking literally everywhere for any sign of this thing or person. And what do you know? I can't find anything. Just as I'm doing this, I pushed too far and I dropped my flashlight all the way down. It immediately goes out and I'm really annoyed. That was my main one with the spare battery in. I had no choice but to go down in the dark and investigate. Annoyed, I put my binoculars to the side. I make my way down the steps and I have this strange feeling that I'm being watched. Just as I get to the very bottom of the stairs, I hear this strange screaming sound in the distance. I almost have a heart attack until I realise it must be an animal. But this sounded far too powerful, and it almost went through me. I quickly reacted by grabbing my flashlight, and realised that it's completely dead. Just as that happens, I hear a scream again. This time, fight or flight takes over and I drop the flashlight, and I sprint all the way back up to the top of the tower and lock the door. I hate to admit it, but I actually barricade myself in, quickly call into the radio that something strange is happening, and cower there for about 5 minutes. I realise I have to investigate and convince myself I'm just being stupid. I grab my binoculars, and feeling more confident now that help is on its way, I head down the stairs slowly. I can't actually see exactly where the flashlight is, and I need to make it to the bottom. Just as I do that, I'm met with that running thing. It's exactly like it's been described to me. It's like somebody sprinting through the forest at full speed with a big backpack on, who's too dark to really make out exactly what they are. I've rubbed my eyes for a second thinking this can't be real, and just like that, it's gone. I decide I've seen far too much now and quickly go back up the tower and decide to ask how long the guys are gonna be. Just as I get up there, I can see a light off in the distance. It's not just any light, it's a flashlight. It's going far too quickly through the trees. I look through my binoculars and I can just about see the slow fading out light of clearly a flashlight. I don't believe what's happening, and then, after sitting there in disbelief for what feels like an eternity, it was probably only 10 or so minutes when I hear my buddy's truck pull up with support. As I get down, I realise that that's my flashlight gone. I just start connecting the dots and say what's happened, and one of the much older workers there says, "Hey, did that running guy steal your flashlight? Yeah, we kind of figured out when you called it in, don't worry about it. We don't know what this is too, but you'll be fine. Don't worry, one of us is going to stay here with you for tonight." I try to explain what's happened, but they all seem to be aware of it like they've encountered it before. I was convinced it was my mind playing tricks on me, but now, I don't really know what to think. I was too scared to even rest for the rest of the shift up in the tower, and they put me with a new guy who was also just as confused as I was. While we're up there, we can see the slow glow of the car driving off, and we both feel pretty scared now. Fortunately, nothing else happened, but to this day, I still have no idea what that thing was. I don't really believe in the paranormal, and I'd like to say it was my mind playing tricks on me, but why do so many of the other workers there know about this? Why has this been going on for so many years? I can never solve this, and I kind of don't want to because it scares me too much. When I first returned from the war, I was a power line rigger. This was on EHV lines, which are extra high voltage, the kind on top of the steel towers. Those are transitional lines, not sub-transitional like most inner city lines. So anyway, I had a job during a heavy windstorm in 2008 to go out and repair some lines near Colorado and the New Mexico border. It was great pay, since it was an emergency call out, so I agree. I met up with my crewman and head down from the Colorado Springs area. We get there at around 9 PM and start getting to work. Windstorms are notorious for failing lines, but not EHV or UHV lines, since they are rigged differently. When I crane up to see the broken link on the tower and inspect the damage, I remembered seeing over the tops of most trees. I observed the view for a moment and saw some nearby lights from a campfire. As soon as I saw the light, I hear yelling coming from that area. Now it must have been about 300 yards away, but I hear a woman yelling. She kept saying, "Someone please help," over and over again. I crane down and start yelling for the guys. They heard it too, and were asking questions. This is really odd. We never see anyone out there. I told them about the campfire lights coming from the direction our trucks were facing. We jump in one of the smaller trucks, since it's a 4x4, and head down the road. We look everywhere for the light, but don't see a thing. We drove back and forth, and then back again and slowed down. We rolled down the windows and stopped the truck in the area where the light should be. We all heard moaning sounds coming from the right of our trucks, so to the north. It sounded like two people are having heart attacks, and I mean really loud. So now we're on edge. The site supervisor was calling the police now. Given the general area we're at, they told us to check to see if we feel safe. Because I have the war veteran attitude, I decided to look. Two guys came down with me, and our supervisor stayed with the truck to wait for police. Apparently, They had a station not too far, like 15 minutes or so away. I armed myself with a pickaxe, and the other guys had conduit pipes like 1 inches. We all started walking through the trees with our headlamps on, because it got really dark now. The moaning's still coming from ahead of us. We got through the trees into a small clearing. It looks empty. The moaning stopped. We checked around and hear nothing. We went back to the truck, and as soon as we got there, we heard the woman yelling again, yelling the same thing. "Someone please help." It was just to the north of where we were. One of the guys yelled back saying, "Where are you?" and gets no reply. Then we hear her scream in pain, and nothing else. We're already running back north and called the police, but they've showed up. They must have seen us running north because 2 of them came after us. We stopped in the field area and they stopped with us and asked what was going on. We told them. They helped us look around and saw nothing. We walked back to the truck and didn't hear anything else. They said they would hang out for us and check if anything else happened, so we get working again. The police are now parked next to each other, talking while we worked. When I craned up, I can't see any campfire lights or anything. We did the job. Took about an hour and a half until we're done. When we were packing our tools to head out, one of the cops left, and the other comes with us. He told us that just to the west, there was a small plane that crashed, and people burned to death. He said the police and paramedics got to the scene, and the fire's still going. He told us about how 2 bodies were found away from the plane, crawling away from it, and one of the bodies is still there somewhere buried from the 70s or 80s. Yeah, we packed up fast and got the hell out of there. Now, I never saw a fire, just light on the trees. Now, I can't tell you how creepy that stuff is to find out afterwards. And the voices and moans were so clear. I always kind of believed in the afterlife after this, but God, did it mess my head up. I'm so glad other people were there to experience it though. The cop believed us too. But I didn't hear anything about reports of a fire or anything else in the area afterwards. Back when I was a Boy Scout, I took a weekend-long training course called National Youth Leadership Training. One of the last parts of the course was an overnight hike into the woods, with no guide, to find our designated campsite and see how we would work under stress. We finally got to our campsite and began to unpack. We each bought a tent, but half of us left ours behind to lighten the load and buddied up. Lo and behold, my buddy brought a 1-man tent only. Either I slept outside or things are going to be really cramped and I didn't want that. The sky was clear and I slept under the stars. The next morning, 4 of the other guys claimed that they saw a coyote walk up to me, sniff my face, stare at me, and leave. They were too scared to go and make it leave. They stuck to their guns though, but I didn't believe them. 4 years later, I was working at the camp as a staff member, and I'm speaking to a senior there, and apparently he said coyotes are pretty common there, and they often boldly show up. It made me realise what the guys were saying wasn't a lie. I just can't believe they let me sleep with a coyote literally at my face. God knows what would have happened if I'd woken up. I went camping with some friends near Lochmond in Scotland. We set up camp about 3 miles into the woods near a small river, and got the fire going to cook some food we brought with us. The site is very remote, but in the evening, a couple of guys hiked through and stopped to chat with us. They're from Poland and seem friendly enough, but ask a lot of questions about our group, how many we were, etc. And I'm a bit suspicious, but I put it down to being from different cultures. It's around 10 PM. I start to feel very ill, and I'm thinking, is it possibly from food poisoning? Now, I'm very confused about this because I'm sure the food was cooked correctly. My friends are all pretty drunk, and I had drunk about 4 or 5 cans of Budweiser. Stupidly, I packed my bag after throwing up hard for 15 minutes and decide to hike back to the main road, watching light fading in the distance. I'm about a mile into the hike back. At this point, I've been sick twice and am completely sobered up by throwing up so much. I've got sports bottles full of water. I now stop to rinse my mouth out. At this point, it's near pitch black, so I got into my bag to get out my torch, small knife and my .22 air gun. As I start zipping my bag back up, I hear twig snap nearby and assume it's a rabbit or fox. I shine my torch, but there's nothing. This doesn't make sense because surely I'm at least going to see reflective eyes, but oh well. 5 minutes later, I hear what sounds like running, maybe 100 yards behind me, and lots of twigs snapping. I turn around and assume it's my friend, and I say, "Are you kidding me?" I said I knew someone's there, and I'm not joking. I see movement through the trees probably 80 feet away. Whatever this is big. I mean 6 or 7 feet tall and completely black. At this point, my sickness is gone, and my heart's beating through my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I get this feeling that I can only describe as feeling almost dizzy at the surreal position that I found myself in. I take off my rucksack and hang it up. I kill my torch. I still think it's my friends, but I have this horrible feeling. It was too big. I've got my knife though in my jacket pocket, and my pistol gripped harder than I can possibly ever do normally. I walk in the darkness for about 100 yards and stop dead behind a tree and wait. I'm trying my hardest to control my breathing, but it's supremely difficult now. Sure enough, I hear movement again. Very difficult to pinpoint, but it's getting closer. Now I'm caught in two minds, to continue to hide or confront. I decide the latter, and now I burst out from the brush. I'm in two minds, but I have to run now. I point my torch in the general direction of the sound, and there's branches moving. I start moving away from the area like an SAS trooper. I hear distance movement again. Lots of twigs breaking now, from heavy footprints. I don't see anyone now, but I know I'll shoot them. Silence now. I wait a few minutes and head back for my backpack. It's not hanging over the branch anymore. It's on the ground. That's the scariest part for me. Whatever I've been chasing could have never beaten me back to my bag. So something or someone else moved it. The branch is intact, which doesn't make sense either. At this point, I travel out onto the main road pretty sharp with no incident. I call my fiance, who quickly picks me up, and I'm violently sick. I believe it's from fear. I tell her about what happened and she's freaking out. To this day, I still don't know exactly what happened. I do know I was terrified and I've never experienced anything like it before or since. I've had a truly weird encounter before. I lived in Southern California at the time, up in the San Gabriel Mountains, a couple of hours east of LA. I know when people think of Cali, they all seem to think of the beaches, but I assure you, the land here is very diverse. My hometown is super tiny and has a fairly popular ski resort on the western side of town. If you take the only highway out past the ski resort for several miles, there's literally nothing but forest. And a very old gold mine is actually still there, and it's kind of cool. After those things, there's nothing but national forest. And then, one insanely isolated, very old restaurant that still functions, and then back to the forest for a long time. Anyway, just setting the scene. I was about 10 or 11 when this happened. It's almost Christmas. It snowed heavily, and the snow's still falling on the evening of this happening. My stepdad decided that we would cut down our own Christmas tree this year, so we get into my mum's big Dodge truck and headed off to the mine, which is a couple of miles past the ski resort. We got to the base of the road and were talking and laughing, etc. My stepdad was driving pretty slow since it was snowing decently. They had ploughed part of this road recently too, and there were big snow berms on either side of us, down near up to the top of the truck, probably 8 feet off the ground. So it's just barely getting dark now. Not quite dark, but twilight I guess. So not dark enough that we can't see anything, but dark enough that the headlights of the truck are on. Quite suddenly, from over on my side there comes a huge dark shape that arches over the top of the snow berm. It lands in the middle of the road fairly gracefully almost. My stepdad slams on the brakes. I am too stunned to speak or even scream, because there crouching in the middle of the road is some creature. It has a long muzzle and pointy ears, covered in fur. Now, I have really never seen anything like it. This all happens in seconds. The thing jumps down and crouches, glancing at us. My stepdad slams on the brakes, and then it just vaulted up and over the beam and disappeared. It must have been 6 or 7 feet tall. I have never seen anything quite like it. My stepdad refused to talk about it when I asked, terrified. If he had seen the same thing too, I knew he did because how quick he braked, and that he was wide-eyed and white for the rest of the journey. I never did bring it up again because we hadn't had the best relationship since then, but sometimes I wish I could know what actually happened then. It still shakes me to my very core, even to this day. I live in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia. It's a beautiful area with hundreds of miles of national forest, some great state parks, and tons of fantastic camping places. Unfortunately, my hometown is also relatively poor, or there are some out-of-town residents from Atlanta and other places. A lot of the people from where I am are really poor. I do freelance work as a technical writer, so I do a lot of work online. If I didn't have that going for me, I'd have to move somewhere else. It's just one of them small towns that will rob you of your ability to accomplish anything in life if you stay there for too long. No opportunities or chances for the people that fairly deserve it. And nothing for miles around, like honestly, you're trapped there. I hated it. To the east of my town, there's a massive national forest. It's loaded with great camping sites and lots of relatively unused hiking trails. I really enjoy hiking on them with my dog, but it can be a bit of an unnerving experience sometimes. It's about a 10-mile drive from town, and there's no cell phone service for miles or houses. In the past, there's been a lot of vehicle break-ins on the trailheads. I mean, literally, the gravel there is littered with bits of broken glass from what I can only assume is break-ins. Sometimes, there's really shifty people hanging around those trailheads or just driving around out on the forest roads. There are really rough roads, and you'll see these beat up $500 cars barreling along them that are meant for a 4x4. Some of the people you see in the cars look like the guy that got crushed by an ATM in Breaking Bad. All that said, it's still a great place to camp. However, you have to be careful. A few years ago, 2 friends of mine and I decided to play paintball in the national forest. We decided to turn the paintball expedition into a camping trip, so we can play the next morning also. After a pretty uneventful day of shooting paintballs at each other, we drive a couple of miles to one of the most popular camping spots. Sadly, a church group or something had taken off all the spots. This really got us annoyed. This was really the only camping spot that we're familiar with, and it's getting late. We decide to keep on looking, so we drive for about an hour further into the woods. By now, it's getting dark, and we're getting worried about finding a spot. We all had GPS on our smartphones, but no service of course. We turn off onto an unfamiliar road that isn't in very good shape. In fact, it looks like the Forest Service rangers used a backhoe to block off the road with a mound of dirt. A broken metal barrier lay in the woods nearby. That being said, it looked like a 4x4 had been going over the mound, so it's worn now. Our F-150 had pretty high clearance, so we decided to go over it. Now, there was an old gravel road on the other side, and the road was pretty much clear of debris. We drove for a few miles down the road, coming across an opening next to a creek. There were some blue traps hanging over a plywood nailed to a tree. That's odd. That said, it was pretty much dark now, and we didn't want to keep driving around all night looking for a camping spot. We left the truck light running, and we set up in the tent. After we set up, I start noticing there's a lot of trash in the woods. I see a green bottle on the ground. I took a look at the label and see that it's a bottle of some home and garden insecticide. I was really tired now and thought someone was dumping some garbage here. None of us thought it was weird that someone would be dumping garbage here when we're more than an hour away from the nearest home. We set up camp, have some beers and made chili from scratch. By this time, it's probably 11 PM and we're eating. We noticed a faint glow from the other side of a nearby hill. At first, we thought it was moonlight filtering its way through the trees. However, the angles don't make sense. It seemed like it was far too bright and wasn't moving. It's a kind of glow you see over a big bright city, and we don't see the light source itself. Since there were no other access roads in the area, we decided it's not campers. The hill was about a quarter of a mile from our campsite, and we investigate. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have done it. However, we had a few rum and cokes in our stomachs, and 2 of us decide to look. My other friend decides to stay. He's gonna do some popcorn on the fire. So we start walking towards the light source, and the situation gets stranger. All the trees in the area have their bark knocked off in a circle around their trunks. It could have been beavers, but Why would they go all the way around a tree in a perfect circle? We start talking about the ghost in pretty loud voices, probably due to our drunkenness. As we're almost to the top, my friend falls and yells out. A few seconds later, the light goes out. We look at each other and decide that maybe we don't need to see what it is after all. Walking back in silence and keep on looking back every few seconds, we decide to turn off our flashlights and return to the campsite with the moonlight guiding us. We get a couple of 100 feet from the campsite. I can see my other friend Isaac walking around. He's wearing a hooded coat that I've never seen him wear before. For some reason, he has a paintball gun. That seems odd. We look at each other. The fire's dying down. We don't see the campsite well. Now, we've been gone for an hour. From the distance, it appears as though my friend is looking for something. He kept walking around the site and peering in. When we're almost back to the campsite, we see our friend walk up the road we came from. We figure he's went to the bathroom and didn't want to wander through the woods like us. When we got back, we sat next to our fire waiting for him to return. All of a sudden, we see him lurch out of the tent and vomits. After we left, he had a few more drinks apparently. We ask him why he's wandering around with the paintball gun, and he gets a strange face and says, "They're locked in the cab of the truck." "Did you unlock it?" "No." We go to the truck and enter the door code and see our paintball equipment just as we left it before. The keys to the truck are hidden underneath a magnetic fob. I get a sinking feeling. What were you doing after we left? I watched a movie then fell asleep. But wait, you were walking around with a paintball gun, right? Did you just change jackets? He said he'd been in the tent the whole time, wearing the same unhooded fleece. Someone had been walking around our campsite, and it wasn't him. At this point, of course, we're all too drunk to drive, but we decide to go ahead and pack up and go back to my house for the night. We don't bother packing up the tent, we just fold it with the sleeping bags and think, heck, jumping in the F-150. When we get up to the dirt hump, we see something grey blocking our path. The metal barrier that's been laying in the woods is now erect. By this point, we've all sobered up. No one wants to get out of the car to try and move the barrier. I had a metal guard on the front of my truck, so I slowly tap it. It falls over, and we drive very slowly over it, terrified we're going to pop one of the tyres and be stranded. It didn't. As we drive down the road, we see a vehicle following us with its lights off. It's probably 1,000 feet behind us, but we keep catching glimpses of it on the moonlight. I now begin to drive as quick as I possibly can. The vehicle keeps pace. It doesn't get any closer though. It just stays 1 or 2 turns behind us, but always follows. After 45 minutes of speeding, we get back to the main paved road. I start to drive everyone back to my home and decide to go a different way. I've never experienced anything like it in my life. Rural camping can be very dangerous, and we've never went back there since. Red River Gorge is a beautiful and huge park full of wildlife, rock climbing, waterfalls and dense forests, gorges and beautiful views. The place feels truly isolated, disconnected from the rest of the world. One evening, my boyfriend D and I decide to go camping at the gorge. We went out and tried to find a campground that was as backwards as possible. Sites were spread far from each other. Our site, that was on the edge of a very steep drop-off. We arrived at sunset and quickly set up. By the time we're fully set up, the sun had set, and we began making a fire. About 20 minutes into relaxing, we began to hear howling that doesn't go away, and it doesn't sound like it's far from us. We're both freaked out by the realization that there were wolves nearby, but we tried to not overreact and continued to sit by our fire. 10 minutes later, I start hearing a faint yelling about 15 feet away past the cliff's edge. Now, I told Dee to be quiet and listen, and we're both frozen out of fear. A woman was now screaming. I couldn't make out any words at that point, but it was a deep, gurgling shriek, a noise that I've never heard a person make in my life before. Then I heard it. She was screaming, "Help, please someone help. Someone please help me," repeating this over and over again, howling at the top of her lungs. I'm terrified. She could have been turned around in the dark and fallen off the cliff. She could have been attacked by wolves or a bear or bitten by a snake. At this point we both sprinted into my car, frantically climbing inside, locking the doors. I tried calling the police but have no service. I threw the car in reverse and sped down the dirt road to find anyone that could help. The shrieks continued. I didn't make it far before I found 3 young men standing on the edge of the forest. I slowed down and cracked my window, still hearing that woman begging for help, and asking the men if they heard that. How could they have not heard it? I told them it was a young woman screaming in the forest. Then, 2 of them went sprinting into the darkness. Without questioning me or anything, the other one just stood by my car, assuring me he had no idea what was happening. While the 2 men were somewhere in the forest, I drove further down the dirt road until I found a spot to turn around at. When I came back, the screaming had stopped, and the men were back by the side of the road. I slowed down and asked them where the woman was, and one of the men that had run into the woods said, "Don't worry, it was actually just a kid messing around." I just said okay. I drove back as quickly as possible. We left the campsite and went straight home. Once out of the woods, we called the local police station multiple times to no answer. I know it wasn't a child. I've never heard such primal screams in my life. It made my skin crawl and my heart race just thinking about it. What did those men do that night? What was I a witness to? I live just where farmland meets the edge of the suburbia, on an island off the coast of BC. The climate here is sub-temperate rainforest, so the natural and untouched landscape is incredibly wild, dense and lush. I'm keen on endurance cycling, and I take full advantage of the trail network in the forest surrounding my area. I work long hours, so most of my winter rides are in complete darkness with my trusty trail light. One section of my home trail winds through a rainforest bog full of hundreds of trees. They're huge. It's absolutely beautiful in daytime. It feels like a magical place with shafts of sunlight piercing the fog, hundreds of different species of flora, and there's so many wild animals out there. It's really beautiful. Now at nights, my gut starts tightening as the thought of passing through this mile-long section of trail appears. One day about a year ago, I was lucky enough to get a chance to go for a ride through it, so I took it. It was cold and very rainy, with few other people out on the trail. I had packed thermos of hot coffee in my backpack, and I thought the rainforest-style bog was the best place to take a rest as any. Now, I chill out. I have an interest in botany, so I was looking closely at the lynches growing off of the huge Douglas fir. But suddenly, I felt distinctly not alone. No biggie. Lots of people use the trail, although not many are out there that day because the weather's so wet and cold. And that's when I heard it. A meow. That's odd because this isn't a good place for a cat to be alone. We have cougars and bears, but I hear a meow again. Except this time, it was canned and robotic sounding, like somebody playing a bad audio file with a cat. My gut starts to clench. It just sounded wrong somehow and I can't figure out why. My hands were shaking when I unzipped my backpack to put my coffee thermos back in. I felt waves of nausea roll over me, and the air suddenly felt dense and thick. I was in a rainforest surrounded by trees and moss, but I felt like I can't get enough oxygen. I hadn't seen anyone for at least 10 miles, and I was distinctly aware of how far I was, and I couldn't really get any cell reception here either. Now, I hear the same meow again, but this time closer. I've never heard a cat like this before. It sounded like an imitation of a cat or a person saying meow. It was so tiny, cold and robotic. I now know that without hesitation, it's time for me to go immediately. I was panicked on the inside but can't show fear, so I casually slung my leg over my bike and start riding. As soon as I got out of the bog, I ride the rest of the way home like a bat out of hell, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I can't see anything. I will never forget this experience for as long as I live. I've had some pretty disturbing things happen on my night rides, but nothing ever like this. I hate the fact that clearly something was imitating a cat, and I'm sure it was a recording. God knows who was out that deep into the forest too. I just hope I don't encounter this again. I used to love going for long hikes in the forest near where I live. I usually did it on summer's evenings. Yeah, I know this probably isn't the safest thing to do, but I always had my hunting rifle on me anyway. I mean, I'd be stupid not to. All it takes is one wild animal to go for you, and if you're unarmed, good luck to you. So anyway, I set out one summer's evening. I had my iPod playing some really chill songs and I felt really good about myself. I can't really get cell phone signal where I go because the trees cover it, but I like listening to my music. Now I was a good 40 minutes into my hike. There was enough moonlight for me to see where I was going. That's how I normally planned my hikes, when the moon was out of its brightest on the most clear days, so I can see everything. I'm really enjoying myself this night. I found true tranquility. I decided to stop for a minute, take off my headphones, and just pour out some of the hot chocolate I had in my flask. Now the second I do this, I have the feeling that I'm not alone, and I can't describe this feeling. It's almost like I'm comfortable in my own presence, but I don't want to be joined by anyone else, and this unsettles me. I just think I'm just being a little paranoid. I say to myself, thank God I've got my rifle, and I could have sworn I heard a laugh afterwards. No, it must have been just an animal, surely. So I go about drinking my hot chocolate. As I do so, and I'll never forget this, I hear someone whisper behind me, "Mind if I have some?" And a terrifying laugh follow. Now the next few seconds is a complete blur as I fumble, fall over getting up, grab my rifle, and scream myself and sprint in the complete opposite direction to where I heard the voice and back onto the trail. I try and scream out that I have a gun, but I can't get the words out. What's worse is I hear rustling behind me. I continue sprinting up the trail, only to slip temporarily again, and now on my back. I lay there wondering whether it's better to pretend I'm still. I look behind me, and I can see what appears to be the butt of a cigarette lit in the distance. Well, looks like I'm going to keep moving then. I get up again, and scream I have a gun and I'm not afraid to use it. What's worse, I'm sure I hear laughter in the distance after saying this. I sprint all the way back to my car. I don't even bother going back for my flask or anything. I immediately get on my radio and call it into the park rangers in the area, who say they're going to check it out and they want me to show them exactly where it is. I say you've got no chance and speed out of there. And the whole drive home, I can't stop thinking, who in their right mind was out there? How long were they stalking me for, and what on earth did they want? They clearly weren't mentally sane, whoever or whatever this was. Now, I don't believe in the paranormal, but this could have easily been something like that, because why would you be out there with no torch or anything? Maybe it is an insane person. All I know is that I never got to the bottom of it, and I never went out on my own in the woods at night again. Now, I worked as a fire lookout, and one of the most scary things that happened to me was while I was actually away from work for a day. I had a family emergency and couldn't actually be at this post that day. Now, when I returned, the whole fire tower was actually on its side and had collapsed. Apparently there was a design flaw that nobody knew about, and luckily the person covering the tower that day had actually stepped out on a patrol and wasn't present. But it's safe to say whoever would have been in it would 100% have died if they were there at the time of it collapsing. I work as a park ranger, so I got pretty used to hearing the sounds of the forest on my own at times. Now, there was one particular time that I kept on hearing somebody's name being called out, but I couldn't figure out exactly where it was coming from. I thought this was bizarre because usually you can at least triangulate where something is, but this time I had no clue. I then realised that it was calling out my name constantly, and it kind of worried me a bit. I then headed over and finally found out where the source of the sound was coming from. And just on the ground, I can see a walkie-talkie that's been smashed up. I pick it up and inspect it, thinking maybe this is the source of the sound, but I still can't figure out exactly where it's coming from. I look off, and to the side up in a tree is a Bluetooth speaker constantly repeating out my name on a loop. It's needless to say I noped out of there and quickly radioed in what happened, and we got the police involved. They eventually get the speaker down, we do a thorough search of the area and can't find anyone. And that's what haunts me. We still have no idea who did it to this day, and whoever put it up there did a good job because there was no fingerprints whatsoever. I ended up leaving that job soon after, and I'm still a ranger, just in a complete different area. I'm a fire lookout, and I have a story I'd like to share with you all from a good few years ago. One day while I was on the job, I headed down to go and get some more water, and I ran into another hiker. He seemed a bit dazed and confused to see people, looking like he'd been out in the forest for a long time. I said hey and he said hey, asking if I knew directions to a certain part of the area we're in. I said yeah and guided him over there. He said oh, thanks, and quickly scurried off. I didn't think much of it, thinking it was just a normal hiker out there. Well, about 3 years later I was watching the news when I saw his face flash on the screen. He'd just been captured for evading the police for a good few months in the area that I was working in, living out in the forest. He had been known to kill multiple people, and I ran into him that day. So I was working as a prospector assistant in central Manitoba one summer. We were doing a helicopter-assisted magnetic anomaly investigation. Really the best summer ever. There's nothing like the ringing in your ears dissipating after the helicopter has dropped you off and the slow increase in a volume of bugs taking its place. You for sure know that you're in the middle of nowhere. It was the last day of our campaign. There was a little piece of property close to the edge of the road that we didn't need a helicopter for. It was a low priority target that we saved until the end. Now we really did so well during that we're happy to have an easy in and out of the bush. Around 9 AM, we heard yelling in one bush. Odd, nothing should be there. We kept on grabbing samples and it's in the back of our mind. Around 11 AM we hear it again, this time closer. We call back yet it's silent. Now though, during our travels of this 30-kilometer piece of property, we come across many pieces of animal evidence, deer, moose, rabbit droppings everywhere. A few other things here and there, even bear tracks and feces, but nothing prepares us for what's next. Around noon, we're in an old blast hole from the 80s. Prospector Dave told me he used to have a blasting license and blow stuff up in the middle of the forest while drinking beer as one of his favourite pastimes. Now that's until they changed the laws after a couple mini forest fires. Now we're facing due west with our GPS on some rocks getting the most precise UMT it could. We then hear an earth-shattering, bone-chilling howl. I look at Dave and he turns white. I picked up the GPS and put it in my belt and unclipped the bear spray for safety. Then, at our 9 o'clock facing due west, another wolf. Then, at our 10 o'clock, another, and another all the way towards the 4 o'clock position. Dave calmly said, "We need to leave, but you can't run, or you die." We left most of our sampling stuff there. We also carried these modified steel sledgehammers for breaking up rocks and stuff. Most useful thing ever, really. It's at the ready along with the bear spray as we walk. Now it was the longest walk of my life and we didn't say a word. I didn't hear anything, but I'm positive they followed us back to the road and into the truck almost. We drove back to the next town and then drank thoroughly. I worked as a tree planter in northern Ontario, living in tents in very remote parts of the forest, like hours away from civilization, which was only accessible by logging roads. The strangest thing, however, was from a fellow planter who found a backpack in the middle of his area with shoes, clothes, a wallet, school ID and camera. How it ended up getting there is a total mystery to us. The scariest for myself was waking up to see that my tent had collapsed and finding a large bear paw rip apparently happening while I slept, as well as turning a corner to see a large wolf about 10 feet away and returning to a spot I'd been about 5 minutes earlier to find fresh mama bear and cub prints, realizing a bear family had basically surrounded me, then turned away while I was sleeping. I was hiking in a national forest with my wife and my dog. The first couple of miles of the trail led to a waterfall and swimming hole. It was fairly well populated with people. We decided to hike past the waterfall, which involved a bit of a climb. Enough at least to keep most people from going past the waterfall. We hike another mile or two without seeing somebody. The whole time my dog was having a great time, happy to be in the woods and happy to walk for 30 minutes if we let her. Suddenly, in a particularly dense part of the trail, she stopped and refused to go ahead. She absolutely would not let us move another inch forward. We stopped and listened and couldn't hear or see anything. The dog though started whining and trying to pull all of us to go backwards towards the swimming hole. I never saw her like that before or since, and I was certain she was legitimately afraid. Maybe there was a bear on the trail or coyote or serial killer hiding in the woods. I'll never know because we listened to our dog and decided to get out of there as quick as possible and maybe avoided some kind of gruesome death out there. This story happened to me several days ago. and it's mostly fresh in my mind, so I'd like to share it. I live in southern Oregon. My county is huge and sparsely populated. It's mountainous to the north, desert to the south and east. My buddy Donnie lived about half an hour from town, about 10 minutes from a resort on a lake in a heavily forested area. On this evening, I had driven out to hang out with Donnie, my friend. We had plans to take my Land Cruiser down some dirt roads. He said he knew of a Forest Service road off the highway that went up to the mountains and ended at a fire watchtower. It's fairly late in the afternoon when we took off, and the sun was already behind the mountains, so the lights fade in now. We left Donnie's house and hit the highway. After a short drive, we turned around onto the Forest Service road and started to head uphill. After a few miles, we were forced to stop abruptly due to a cat front-end loader sitting parked across the road. The equipment had been purposely parked in order to block the road. It was perpendicular to the road. The logs had been dragged onto the road to block off the shoulders. My friend Donnie said to me, "This wasn't here the other day, let's try another way round." We get out of the cruiser and the woods were nearly dark and silent, except for the wind in the pine trees. There was no easy way around the loader, nothing that wouldn't involve beating up the Land Cruiser. We decided that we're gonna head back down the road and find a different road up the mountain. After a short trip down the gravel road, we found a promising trail that would put us around the loader, up the mountain once more. So we take the trail, and after a short drive uphill, we saw the loader through the trees. Feeling satisfied, we continued on our way to the fire towers. Now we hadn't gone far. However, we noticed another odd thing, a shipping container which is really sitting just off the road to the woods, back in the trees. That definitely wasn't here, Donnie says, stating it certainly wasn't there the other day too. At this point, I started to feel uneasy. The woods were unnaturally still, even for evening. The weather had been nice, birds and small animals should still be moving around, right? Well, we decided to investigate the shipping container. I drove the cruiser through the brush and up to the container. It was like a dark colour, almost tanned but with no markings. The doors were actually padlocked shut, and we sat there uneasy, on edge for several minutes. The woods are growing darker, and we finally made the decision to leave. I turned the cruise back to the road and start heading downhill. "Oh dude, there's some guys in the brush," Donnie yelled. Now this makes me back out of my thoughts. Sure enough, out of nowhere seemingly, 3 guys were uphill, and they're coming towards us on the road. I quickly yanked the wheel and pulled the cruiser onto a side road, heart pounding. "Who are they? What are they doing?" I yelled. I felt my stomach drop when I realized that the road is on a loop and was bringing us right back to where we had just been. As the truck shot out of the side trail back onto the main gravel road, I realized that one of the guys was less than 10 feet from the cruiser. These guys know the woods, and the guys also knew that the trail would bring me back to them. "Hang on," I yell as I yank it into reverse. I managed to just dodge the man in the road with his companions running too. I pushed the Land Cruiser for all I could get from its engine. Now the engine's actually a bit old and I'm a bit worried about it. We're very careful while driving because the trees are literally whizzing past us and we go back towards a paved road. We finally hit the highway and decide not to drive towards Donnie's house. Instead, we took the highway back towards town. "Where did they come from?" Donnie said. Thinking back, I've actually not seen any other trucks or anything in that area like this just parked up and suddenly appearing. And they just appeared, running out of the brush. Now by this particular moment, we've actually gone several miles when I noticed lights coming up behind us on the highway. They were still quite far back, but coming up fast enough that they would catch up in a minute or so. I accelerated, determined not to be caught. We rounded a slight bend and I slammed on the brakes and drove the truck into the woods once again and turned off the lights. Moments later, a truck went flying down the highway past where we're hiding. We waited a few moments longer and then drove onto the highway, heading back to Donnie's house by taking many back roads. We didn't get followed now, and we didn't see anything out of the ordinary when we drove past the same spot on the highway where we originally turned. Now I'm really not sure what those guys were doing out there, or why they chased us. Two things are for sure though, they didn't want us there and they weren't planning on letting us go back there in the future. Now I live in a beach community with a maritime forest nearby, and while hiking about 40 years ago, found a massive sea turtle hanging from a tree. I bet the shell was for free to cross. I figured somebody was hoping to recover the shell after the poor thing had deceased, but I have no idea how it got up there. Now, working in a rainforest in Southeast Asia many years ago, one of the things we did was trap moths at night. You sit in front of a big white sheet with a lamp in front of it powered by a generator, and then periodically go and see what insects had actually been attracted to the sheet. Incidentally, the insects attracted frogs, which then attracted snakes and whatnot. Due to the noise at night, the trap was about a mile away from camp, so you'd be there at 3 AM, all alone in the middle of the jungle. One cloudy night, after there wasn't much happening on the 1 AM to 3 AM shift, I heard rustling besides me. And that wasn't unusual, but it was a bit bigger than I was used to hearing. The rustling got closer and I started to get tense. It got closer still, and I was thinking that I'm gonna get eaten by a tiger. Suddenly, a disembodied face broke out of the tree line screaming in an unintelligible language. I have a heart attack, scream a little, and the disembodied face disappeared back into the woods, while simultaneously issuing high-pitched giggles. It was only after my heart slowed down that I realized that it's probably someone trying to scare me, but I'm still not sure. Now, I didn't see but heard, so my husband and I were hiking in a state park on the east coast. It was midday during the week, so we maybe encountered 2 other people the 3 hours we're out and about. The only sounds we heard are from ourselves, our dog, and some animals and birds, when all of a sudden, I started hearing mild chanting. I tell my husband if he heard it too, and he nods and tells me be quiet. My dog's ears were at full alert, and the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. We continued walking, and the noise turned into full-blown monk chanting. Think Halo Georgian chants. It was as clear as day, like standing next to a speaker. To make myself feel better, I convinced myself it was some teens hiding down playing it on their phones. And after 5 minutes of hearing it, it disappeared, and we barely spoke a word for the last 3 miles back. While working as a park ranger, there was one thing that a couple of us could never explain. Every so often, we would hear a strange calling out in the forest. Not like a normal sound, more like a chanting sound, but animalistic, if that makes sense. One day there was a couple of us going out on a patrol when we hear this sound again. My friend laughs and says, maybe it's our time to finally see Bigfoot, which we all laughed at. Then, crashing from a tree behind where we're standing, we see a figure that's roughly 7 feet tall, smashing through the trees, almost knocking them over while it moves, and there was an absolutely disgusting stench to accompany this. Its face almost looks like a wolf face, but it's pretty hard to see because it's so hairy. We all looked at each other in disbelief for a second, then glanced back as this thing quickly went off deeper into the forest. Now, one of my friends was convinced it was someone in a bear suit playing tricks on us, but the way it knocked the trees over was unbelievable, and it stank in this area for literally days afterwards. We did a big investigation, but couldn't find anything. Now, I worked in fire lookout towers for a couple of years. It's a job that I had thoroughly enjoyed, and I remember one particular event that I'd like to share with everyone. It's scary for different reasons than other stories that you're probably used to hearing on here, but let me explain. This happened during one beautiful summer's day. I'd been up in the tower for a couple of days and I was really enjoying my time. I was reading a couple of books and having a really good time. I actually like to write in my spare time, and I guess just English and writing is my passion in general. So the day started like any other. I'd woke up and made myself a coffee and checked in on the radio station to make sure that I was doing okay and if there was any particular instructions. Also, I needed a weather forecast. I ended up talking to my other friend who wasn't too far away on another radio, and we just had a good conversation. After our conversation, I finished another coffee. I used the first one to make me wake up and the second one to enjoy it, and I used the toilet as you can imagine from drinking so much coffee. I had some breakfast and needed to set out for a while. I had certain things I needed to go and inspect to make sure everything was normal. I count my way down the steps, which is something I always do just out of habit. I make it to the bottom of the tower and double check that I've actually closed the door and everything. And I can't remember exactly if I locked it or not, but I'm not too worried. I haven't seen anyone out here for a while. I then set out on the gravelly path. Now, the path itself is actually pretty nice because we have some gravelled areas which is a lot better for your feet than walking over the true forest land. There's quite a lot of trees that have been downed, and I really have bad times slipping on these because I'm not necessarily too careful. I'm always taking in what's just ahead of me. I continue walking on my gravelly path and I can see the trees ahead of me are roughly 100 feet tall. They're really beautiful. I continue going forward to make my way onto a small bridge. The bridge has been there for a while and it's made out of wood, and I know that might scare some people, but I think it's actually really cool. What's nice about the bridge is that you can see some fish in the water nearby it, with parts of a river that's running past where I am. The reason I like to walk this way too is I get to see parts of nature that I can't see up in the towers. Because of course, if you're constantly scanning the horizon, you don't necessarily get a chance to see what's actually going on directly underneath you. So I head over the bridge and everything's fine. I'm actually running a relative inspection on the bridge as something that I have to do, which is one of my duties. I continue walking along the stream now, which is really beautiful and picturesque, and everything's normal. I don't actually have my radio with me at the time though, because I just want to enjoy this part of the day, and to be truthfully honest, I've actually forgotten it. I'm not too worried though, because I've never had a radio call very early in the morning, and I'm pretty confident being out here on my own. I continue on my trek and make notes that nobody's been around here, and there's one area that I have to check out because there's been reports of people loitering around, but I can't really see anyone. I do find a strange kind of clearing that looks like people have been there recently, but there's no signs of life whatsoever. I think most likely it's some kind of animals that people have seen in the night time and mistaken them for people, so I just put it down as nothing. Now the whole time that I'm doing this, I'm constantly taking notes of my surroundings, making sure that everything's okay. The thing is, when you're a fire ranger, you have to remember that a fire can start at literally any time, and you're responsible for the safety of everyone in your area and the surrounding areas. It's a job that I took very seriously, so I was always on point with things like this. I continue on my short trek, and the trees actually changed slightly. They're a little bit more skinny now, and there's not really much of a path for me to follow, and there's lots of large rocks around. Now, one good thing I noticed is lots of moss type things on the ground, which is very important because it means the air's not too dry, and hopefully it stops any fires spreading if they would start. Now, as I'm walking, I hear a very loud thud sound. It literally sounds like something really big has fell out of a tree. I stop for a moment and think maybe it's a tree that's just fallen, or maybe an animal has fell out of it like a bear or God knows what. I have a look, and for the life of me, I can't seem to locate where the sound comes from. It was either that or some kind of Bigfoot. I laugh and continue onwards, thinking it's probably just a fallen tree. I make it up to a hill and I do some more surveying and everything's as it should be. I've now completed this part of my duties and I'm heading back towards the tower. I'm actually pretty happy now. The first part of the morning is actually always my favourite and I like knowing that I'm out here mostly on my own. I've got another 2 or 3 days ahead of me up here, so I need to make sure I keep my mind occupied. So I decide to do some reading. I speak on the radio once again to my friend, and I tell him that I actually heard a strange sound, which was like something really heavy falling, but I can't figure out exactly where it's from. My friend laughs and says he's actually heard the same before, but not to worry about it. It's probably just some trees falling down where their time's come. I agree and stop what I'm doing. I hear another sound outside that sounds very similar to what I was just speaking about to my friend. I tell him there's something I need to check out and I'll be back soon. He says roger that. Over. I say over and head out. Now, I wasn't really sure what I heard this time because obviously I was talking to my friend and I wasn't necessarily engaged with what was happening around so much. And I realised that whatever it was must have been coming from near the stream. I think it's quite odd, and I'm worried that maybe it's somebody out here that's in trouble. It could also be from a fire where a tree's fallen, but I would know if it was a fire, and this sounded different. I ended up making my way along the rocks to roughly where I thought that I heard the sound from. I take a moment, pause, taking everything, but yet find nothing. Now, just off ahead of me, I'm certain that I can see a person just off the other side of the forest, dressed in virtually all black, just going behind a tree. I think, oh, so that's a bear, so I probably need to get back now. I don't have any bear spray or anything like that with me because I've come out very quickly to investigate. I'm pretty worried because if this is a baby bear, then Mama Bear's going to be pretty angry. And God knows how many there are, and I'm not really ready to fight them. I think they were probably trying to get some fish in the water or I don't know, so I decide to head back. I'm pretty careful to trace my steps and make sure that nothing's actually following me and I can beeline back to the tower. I ended up making it back and I put a small barrier over the bottom of my tower. Now this is something that we had been told to do just in case of situations like this, but to be honest, I don't think it's going to make any difference at all really if a bear comes, but it's what I was doing. I'd made sure I disposed of all my food correctly too, so I knew they probably weren't coming up for food, so this meant they were probably angry at me for going into their territory. And then make my way back up to the top and I report to my friend and the other station that I think there's bears, and just to let the other guys keep a watch out, and that if I don't report back in time, to assume the worst. They say that's completely fine and they don't want me to investigate further, thankfully. I do keep an eye out, however, with my binoculars though. I'm now back doing my job looking for fires again, and it's starting to get a little bit dark now. I think this is good, because it means that the bears are probably going to eventually go off and do other things and try and get sleep or whatever they do, and I can have some more rest now. It's almost coming up to the part of the shift where I can sleep, so I'm pretty happy about this. Basically, another worker's going to take over from a nearby station that can overlook my area, and I can get some sleep. So, forgetting about the events from the day, I go into my bed and I have a really nice sleep. I wake up the next morning and I repeat my routine. I have a coffee where the first one's basically to help me wake up and the other one's something that I can enjoy. I still have to repeat the same things as yesterday and make sure nobody's loitering around or camping where they shouldn't be, so I grab my things and my radio this time and step down, counting my steps as I go. I go through the gate and I stop in my heels. That's odd. I was certain I left the barrier up that stops things going up into the station. I look around and make sure nothing else is off and there's no people or animals, but there doesn't seem to be anything. I go and investigate. I look for any claw marks or anything that signals that maybe an animal did this, but strangely I can't see anything. Again, I think this is pretty bizarre because I've not really experienced this before, but I just put it down to myself being tired and probably not thinking much, though I do actually take note of it this time as being something very weird. Now I continue on like normal and actually have to set out a different way than before. This time I don't get to go over that beautiful stream again, and it's actually annoying because I have to go to where I'm sure I saw a bear the other day. I'm a lot more cautious now and I have a bear spray with me which is easily within reach. I'm also armed with a weapon, but I'd rather not use it and actually save the bear if possible. But of course, if the bear spray doesn't work, then I'm definitely going to use it. So I head out again, and this time it's a little bit different from yesterday because now in fact there are signs of life and people being here recently. There's the remnants of a campfire which has been put out recently and some other trash laid around. That explains why the bears were coming, and it's also quite dangerous because this could make a fire and this is what my job is for, protecting against. So I quickly report it in on the radio and make a note of it myself. One annoying thing is I now have to keep an eye out in case anybody's messing around, but who would do it that close to a station, I wonder? That's something that freaks me out a little bit. I think it's very bizarre that they don't care that I'm there and they have their own fire going. I think this is odd, but I put it down to being nothing, and I continue looking for further signs of life around, human specifically. I hear somebody talking on the radio now, and I tone in on it. I can hear people talking. They're saying, yeah, he's still moving around, we'll have to go and find him later. It's quite hard to make out exactly what they're saying, but some of the other fire workers or park rangers have obviously found some people messing around here that shouldn't be and are trying to locate them. I think this is good because at least I'm not doing this all on my own now. I ended up switching off to another channel, which is my main one, and I continue on. I don't find any other signs of life now, but every so often I am certain that I can see a tall silhouette figure in all black just off in the distance, just far enough that I can actually doubt what I'm seeing. I'm pretty sure this is a bear, but the weird thing is it was standing up straight now. So it means it wasn't a bear, but I don't know what else it could have been. I think this is pretty odd, and I just put it down to my mind messing with me a bit because of being out here for a while alone. I've now completed the main thing I need to do for the day and can actually head back again and just relax a little bit. Now when I get back to the tower, I'm sure that something's off. I can't describe exactly what it is, but the atmosphere just feels different. I once again put the gate down and I make sure that I'm 100% certain I've done this correctly, so I don't have to second guess and doubt myself like I did before. I have one look around for bears or other animals and I don't see anything and make my way up the stairs. Now when I get to the very top, I can just about make out a light coming from the area that I checked out the other day. Bingo, I think. This is it, a fire. I can go and report it in. I quickly go and grab my binoculars and take a closer look. I can just make out a red-amber glow with the binoculars. Just as I go to radio it in, it goes out, like it didn't start. I begin questioning what I'm actually seeing, and I decide to actually step out from inside of the cabin thing at the top onto the balcony. I have my coffee in hand, and I realise that there's nothing actually there, but it's something I should probably investigate. I radio in what I'm seeing and that I'm going to investigate it, thinking there's a potential cause of fire not far from where I am, and head down. I count my steps again like normal, and thankfully this time the barrier's still in place that I put there before. I quickly hopped over it to save time, and somewhat excitedly head out with my flashlight. I make it to the exact spot where I thought I could see the red glow, and there's nothing there. I think this is really odd. I have quite a powerful torch and I'm scanning it around everywhere, but there's no signs of anything. Not even a cigarette on the ground, nothing. I don't smell smoke or anything, so I know that it's probably nothing, but I think it's pretty odd. Maybe it was a firefly or God knows what kind of insect I don't know about, but I'm just relieved that there's not going to be a fire, and I should be able to get a good night's sleep. And then quickly go back up to the tower, jump over the barrier again, and now speak on the radio explaining that there's nothing out of the ordinary here. I then head outside and go to grab my coffee again, and I realise something odd. I must have left it indoors and not realised. I look inside and it's nowhere to be found. I head out again to check the whole balcony and there's literally nothing. I think this is extremely weird because I know for a fact I had it there, and you can still feel part of the wooden balcony is warm from where I rested my cup earlier. So again, I think this is really bizarre, but maybe I'm just tired and need some sleep, I put it down to. I'm a little bit paranoid now, and I actually try and barricade the door a bit with the end of my bed. I close all of the blinds and radio in that it's my turn to switch off for the night, and someone else is going to take over the search for fire, and I gladly fall asleep. I wake up and I'm excited because it's only 2 days left and I get to go home relatively soon. Usually being out in the wilderness like that is something that I thoroughly enjoy, but not this time. Something was just off and I couldn't describe exactly what it was. I wake up and have my morning coffee, and I head out to just peer over the balcony and see how everything is and take in the nature. I'm leaning on the balcony and I put my cup down and I have a double take moment. There's another cup of coffee sitting there. It's very cold and has clearly been there overnight and it's half drank. I realise then that this is a cup of coffee that I left there from the other day. Now what's weird is it's in a complete different place from where I would usually leave my coffee. It's very close to the edge and I certainly didn't put it there. I'm very freaked out now and quickly throw it off to the side and take it inside with my new cup. I decided not to tell anybody about this just in case I was getting a bit tired and my mind was playing tricks on me from being lonely. And I report in that most things are normal and I'm gonna do my daily duties again. This time I take my coffee in a flask with me and I actually don't feel as safe in the tower as I usually do, and I'm quite happy to be getting away from it. I head down like normal and count my steps, and luckily nothing's disturbed my barrier. But this is odd now, because clearly something's been up there moving my cups around, maybe some animal, but there's no signs of anything. I have a look around and I can't see any claw marks or anything. Maybe it's a really small animal like a raccoon or God knows what up there, but that's really weird. How would it possibly know to move my cup and then put it back? And why would it have not just drank it and quickly gone off again? And why on earth would something want to crawl all the way up there? This was really weird now, but I decided that I should just get on with the day like normal and try and forget about everything that's been happening. I set off on my hike and begin. Now this day I have to head back over the beautiful bridge again, which is something I'm quite happy to do. I make my way onto the middle of it and I stop for a moment to take in the beauty of everything. I actually think about how lucky I am to have a job like this and how many great things I've actually had from working here. I met a lot of great friends and I've really found a true inner peace from being out in the nature, And I think I've learnt a lot about myself too, which is something I'm very happy about and still proud of to this day. Now while I'm standing there on the balcony, I hear a clapping sound, which I think's really odd. I laugh to myself thinking, oh, maybe somebody heard my speech and thinking aloud, when I look up on the horizon and I can see a figure standing there, once again, dressed in all black, completely motionless, just out of sight of where I can clearly make out who they are or what they're doing. I shout out, hey, this time really frustrated, saying, what are you doing here? You know you're not supposed to be here. Who are you? And there's no reply. I explain who I am and say that I'm about to radio this in, and the boys are going to come and find you. You're not supposed to be camping here. This is your last warning. Now this figure does not move at all, which starts to make me question whether it's an animal or not. I think, God, maybe Bigfoot is real. I've seen a UFO before and I doubted them, so maybe a Sasquatch is about to come and get me. Now I can clearly see this figure raising its hand to its mouth, then slowly sidestepping into the trees. I'm pretty convinced now this isn't a bear or normal animal, but who could possibly be out here and why the hell are they doing this to me? What's worse is that I try and radio this in, but I can't get reception for some reason. I know my best bet now is to hike off a little bit up to a hill, and this is actually where I need to go. I feel confident enough that I should be able to hold my own if it comes to it in a conflict, because I'm relatively big and I've done some martial arts before, and I'm armed. But this is weird. I don't really have a choice now other than to go to the hill and radio in what I've seen. Now I'd like to say I did this fairly confidently, but I basically half sprinted and jogged all the way up to the hill. I quickly get onto the radio and say what's happened, and would you believe it? The controller tells me that I need to be 100% confident that this is a person and not an animal, and that I have to investigate. I say, are you kidding me? And I explain everything that's happened, and he says this is pretty bizarre, and to check in a couple of hours. I say a couple of hours, I might not have that long. What if there's a group of people out here? He laughs and says, don't be silly. Come on, you've only got a couple more days left, and this is probably just your mind going a bit funny as it's near the end of your shift. I'll tell you what, you can go early tomorrow if you like. I reluctantly declined though, because I don't want to have to call this early and have them thinking I'm crazy and my reputation going. I quickly fill out the notes saying I've done all the checks I need, but I didn't. I didn't really look properly at anything when I was running up this hill. I'm just happy to be up the hill and speaking to another person again. I open my coffee and start drinking it, and it tastes pretty weird because it's been so shaken up by my jogging. But I'm pretty happy I can sit and enjoy this for a moment, and to be honest, I pretty much forgot about what happened. I start to calm myself down and say, you know what, maybe the controller was right. Maybe this is just my mind playing tricks on me and there's nothing for me to worry about and it's all in my head. I now take it one step at a time and somehow convince myself into continuing the rest of my checks. Now I actually finished my searches without finding anything out of the ordinary. Call it Dutch courage or I don't know what because I didn't drink any alcohol, but the coffee seemed to give me some energy to investigate a little. I ended up going right to where I saw this figure standing and stopping for a moment to be still, to take in the surroundings. I can't see anything. Now what I think is bizarre too is that I was a long way from that bridge, and I don't know how anything could have actually heard me up there. I could barely hear anything other than the running water now, and I think this is really bizarre. I take a moment to look around and my ears start ringing. I learnt later that this is out of fear and stress, but at the time I didn't know why it was happening. I can't stop the ringing from happening, and I realise that I probably need to get back into the station. What's more annoying is I still have more to do this day. Just as I start heading up the stairs, I take a moment to look behind me, and I'm sure for a second I can see another figure. I look to my left and right, but when I look again it's gone. I tell myself, calm down, everything's okay, you're gonna be fine. I still need to get into the tower and actually tell them that I'm okay and that I've investigated. To be honest, I only really investigated subconsciously. I don't really think it was a conscious decision, but I quickly hop onto the radio and explain everything. The controller says, see, everything's fine. Don't worry, we'll get the night watch to keep an eye on it for you. I say, oh yeah, thanks, great, that makes me feel better. He says just relax. If you're 100% sure and can positively identify that there's some people out here that shouldn't be, we'll send in the cavalry. And with that, I know all I can do now is say Roger and over, and he says the same, and to keep careful out there. Now, I decided to arm myself with both the bear spray and my weapon at the same time, which is something I didn't usually do, because I wanted to have every situation planned for in case anything else happened to me. Now, I actually ended up reading for a little while just to try and take my mind off of things. I felt extremely tired and was trying to keep myself awake. I decided to make another coffee and go out onto the balcony. It wasn't too far from sunset and I actually had a little bit of time left before I needed to go to sleep and call into the other tower to let them know that it was their turn to take over and that I was going to get some shut-eye. Now, I actually decided to call in a bit earlier this time and explain everything that had happened to the other worker who was going to be watching over me. I wanted him to know what the dangers were and that if anything were to happen to me, then he knew roughly what had happened. Thankfully, he completely understood and said that was crazy, and that some of the other guys had actually seen similar things before but equally had it brushed off in the same area that I worked in, apparently as recently as a couple of months ago. I said, great, why did nobody tell me that before? And he said we didn't really want to worry anybody out here, but we wanted to get live feedback too to know whether this was actually accurate or not. He recommended that I slept with the barrier down and that I also barricaded myself in and had my weapon ready next to my pillow, and this was exactly what I was going to do. I thanked him for the positive encouragement and actually believing me about what I was saying, and he actually said, without saying it directly, that they had some problems with the controller not necessarily believing what they were saying to them, and that the moment there was anything weird to give him a call and he'd be right over. I actually felt fairly nice now hearing this, and I was actually able to fall off to sleep relatively easily. Now at one point I did wake up in the night and heard a banging sound, but I'm not sure whether this was just me, because I accidentally knocked my torch off my bed at around the same time, so I ended up falling asleep again. This time when I fell asleep, I actually felt pretty good, and I felt very happy waking up knowing that this was going to be my last day out here, and I didn't really have too much to worry about. I call in quickly to the tower and let them know that everything's okay, and I then thank my friend for doing his part and making sure I was okay. He says roger that, I'll speak to you in a couple of hours, over. I repeat affirmative, over, and start my day. Now this time everything seems normal and I'm actually a lot more happy than I was the last few days. I think the simple fact of speaking to somebody who actually believed in me made all the difference, and I actually felt a lot more confident now. I ended up heading out to the exact same area that I thought I saw something the other day, because I had to pass this way to get to the area that I needed to inspect, and I didn't really think anything of it, and nothing seems out of the ordinary. I even passed by the original campsite that I had saw, and I realised that nothing had been there since the time I last inspected it. The fire had gone long ago, and it made me feel a lot more confident. During my lunch break, I decided that I want to go back to the same bridge to just sit in the middle and relax. Now the biggest thing I was scared of now was maybe the bridge giving way, but I knew that was extremely unlikely. I ate my food there and just relaxed. I ended up laying on the floor, just with my hat down, looking towards some of the clouds. I can only do this every so often because it actually hurts my eyes, but tinting the hat down was really a beautiful thing. I start thinking about how lucky I am to be out here with the nature and animals, and that the animals seem to accept me here, and it's almost like they can sense that I'm not necessarily dangerous for them. I could be wrong, but I think some animals can actually sense whether people are nice or not, and this puts a smile on my face. While I'm laying here, I actually consider about making a novel maybe, and writing a bit about my stories, but I decide that's for another day, and that I have a long career ahead of me. I get up and everything's normal, and I make my way back down the gravel path. I like the sound of the gravel under my shoes, and I like all of the birds and whatnot in the trees. I make my way back towards the base of the tower, and everything's as it should be. I start to think maybe the controller was right and there was nothing for me to be worried about, and I head up, but I'm still not completely out of the clear. I still have to survive another night here, so I put the barrier down once again and make my way back up the tower, counting my steps like usual. I think this is just a habit I picked up that makes me feel better and more reassured in my situation, and that I haven't got to worry about anything. I get back to the top and I radio in that my shift's come to an end and I'm gonna call it in for the night, and in the morning I'll be returning back home. The controller says, "Well done, buddy, I told you there's nothing to worry about," and I thank him and sign off. I then call into the next tower over and say everything's fine, as he's about to watch my area for me. I take one last look with my binoculars for extra measure to make sure there's no signs of fire, and I now head in to my bed, once again fortifying myself here. Now I didn't want to fall asleep too quickly, so I leave my torch on above me so I can read. I'm reading a really nice novel that I picked up a couple of weeks ago, and I actually destroyed a few pages in my bag, and I was kind of making up in my head what the rest of the story should be. I didn't bother taping it up. I decided it was better that way. It's sort of become a part of me in a sense, if that makes sense. I have a good time, and before you know it, I was sound off asleep. I seem to fall into a very deep sleep this time because I don't actually remember dreaming or much of anything. I do remember waking up to a glow outside. I feel pretty happy because it means that my shift is over and that I'm about to head off home. I put my socks on and start boiling the kettle. Then I take a moment to look outside. I realise it must be the very start of sunrise because I can't see much else illuminated. I start making my coffee and I realise something's off. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but maybe, just maybe, there's something not right here. I glance down at my clock quickly to get my bearings and it says 3 AM. Something's definitely wrong now. Why am I seeing any light at this time? Oh no. It must be a fire, I've realised quickly, and I suddenly fill with adrenaline. I quickly call into the tower that there's a fire very close to me, and they ask for the bearings, but I don't have them yet. I say I'm about to find out and to stay on the line. I quickly grab the binoculars and I look to where the glow is, and I can see the start of a large fire. It's very close to the tower, so now I have to get out of here. I now scream over the necessary information about where the fire is, and I go quickly to take another look. I look to the base of the fire and I'm trying to figure out exactly why this has started. I look to the left and realise that there's a large rock obstructing the view, and a few other skinnier ones. I think this is odd because I haven't seen them before. I take a moment to let my eyes adjust and I realise there's 4 figures standing there in the fire. I let out a scream, and to my horror, just through the fire I can make out one of them waving to me. I realise instantly that I need to get out of here as soon as possible. I quickly grab my radio and run downstairs. I get down as quick as I possibly can and jump over the barrier. Annoyingly, I left most of my belongings at the time, but I didn't care now. What's worse is I don't have a torch. I realise, God, I didn't call in on the radio I was about to abandon post, but at the time I truly didn't care. Luckily I still had my small radio with me, so I quickly scream over to my friend what's happening at the other tower. He says he's going to let everyone know just to make it over to him, which is great because that means at least a 2 kilometer hike. The worst thing is I don't have my torch, so I can't figure out exactly where I need to go. I look towards where the fire is after about a minute of running, and just as I approach the bridge, I realise I can't see any figures now, but the fire's spreading pretty quick. I decide that I'm going to stay close to the water because as a last resort this can probably save me, and it should eventually be able to get me over to my friend. Now when I'm sprinting, I hear a clap sound again. At first I didn't turn around because I thought maybe it was the sound of branches snapping from the fire. I continued jogging for another 30 seconds when I met with more clapping, just more distant. This time I'm almost frozen in horror and force myself to turn around, and I can see 4 figures standing on the bridge clapping me. I let out a scream and start sprinting again. I quickly hold onto the radio and scream what's happening, but I'm not met with anything other than silence. I try again and realise, God, I'm not at the area where I can get signal. I have to try and get over the hill at least. My feet actually feel like they're burning because they're not designed to go over terrain like this fast, but I keep going. Luckily, I'm relatively fit and I can keep up quite a decent pace. I run for a number of minutes and stop again to try and see if anyone's following me. I stop for a good couple of minutes until I can see a torch just off the path where I'd been not too long ago. I'm pretty certain I'm being followed now, and I have basically tumbled down the hill. I didn't mean to, and I ended up really hurting my legs doing so, but I basically slipped down the whole thing. I busted up my arm pretty bad too in the process. As I come to a stop at the bottom of the hill, I can no longer see the fire because it's out of the line of view. This is good for 2 reasons. 1, it calms me down a bit, and 2, it means my friend isn't that far away and help. I go to call in on the radio, but I realise that I've lost it in the tumble. I say, God, I can't believe you've lost this, to myself as I force myself back to my feet. What's worse though is I've had to adopt a kind of slow hikey pace to try and make it out to where my friend is because of my injuries. What's worse is where I have to jog now, I'm not really going to be able to see much further ahead until I'm basically at the base of his tower, which isn't really great because I could be going in the wrong direction now. And that's just what happened. For the first 2 minutes, I'm certainly going in the wrong direction. I stop for a moment to catch my breath and hide underneath a tree. Just as I do so, and I'm able to calm my thoughts and slow my breathing down, I'm met by a running water sound. I do a small prayer and thank God for leading me in the right direction. I now head very close to the stream, and I know this is going to lead me to my friend. I ended up wading through the water a little bit by accident because it's quite dark out now. I can feel blood on my arm, and I'm a little bit worried about it getting infected, but that's a later issue. I decide I'm okay to walk a little bit now, and I continue onwards. I need to walk just to gather my breath and not make my injuries worse when I see more lights ahead of me. Oh no, they must have followed me when I slowed down and saw where I headed, I think, and I quickly ducked down in the water. I'm just off on the side of a bank and trying to hide myself amongst rocks. I don't know what to do at this point. If these people are ahead of me, I have no option but to hide. I decide the best thing to do is to get a visual, and I quickly peer over the bank. I see the lights again to my horror, but then after a moment I realise they're blue flashy lights. These are police, and there seems to be a few of them. I feel a wave of relief wash over my body, one that I've never felt before, as I re-emerge from the embankment. I head up the hill, and I go to shout out for help, but I stop myself, realising I'm not entirely out of the danger yet. I continue walking along the edge of the bank, and I eventually make it over to the path that leads to the tower. I have to be careful now because I don't want to make them jump and they attack me by accident. So I instead decide that I should call out the name of the other worker that's my friend. He then screams back to me, "Mark, Mark, I knew you were there, Mark. I said, quick, go help him. Where are you, Mark? And quickly 2 police officers rush over to me. I ended up collapsing to the floor and slowly telling them what has happened. This is at the same time they're starting to patch me up for my injuries. I say there's a group of people out there that have just set fire to next to the tower that were trying to hunt me down. They ended up calling it in to get more support and some other rangers to come and help out with the search. My buddy gave me a big cup of coffee and quickly put a blanket over me, helping me get into the car where I was driven off to get help for my injuries. The police were happy with the information I'd given them, and they decided not to bother me too much because clearly I was in a state of shock. In the drive over there, I remember just putting my head on the window and slowly drifting asleep. It turned out that I had sprained my arm and twisted my ankle, and I had a large cut, but luckily the police had done a really good job of helping patch that up, and I didn't end up needing to go to the hospital. I was taken home where I was able to recover, and the police took some more details from me. I thanked them for the help and they left. A couple of hours later, Mark came to join me. He gave me a big hug and said sorry for everything that happened to me. I explained everything and he said I did the right thing and not to worry, that I could have however much time off I needed from work. He then explained that the police did a large search and so did some of the rangers. He didn't end up helping out with it because he still had to cover his area, but he was very worried about me. He told me that the police didn't find anything initially, but they were going to continue searching and that they'd update me after what had happened, and that they were definitely going to press for criminal charges as soon as they captured him. He then said he really hoped he could get his hands on them first. Now the following weeks and months after that was a blur. The following few months and weeks after that were actually a blur. I still struggle to remember much of it even to this day. I ended up leaving that job and working a similar one in a different area. I'd never had anything like it happen to me since, and as you can imagine, it still traumatizes me a bit to this day. I made contact with Mark a few times since and we're actually really good friends still. He actually quit his job there too the following day, and he does something completely different now, working in a wood shop. The annoying part about this is I never actually found out what come with the investigation, or whether these people were actually found or not. I just hate the not knowing part. I tried to make contact with the police, but they wouldn't give me much information about it, but I think it's important for people's safety. I still don't really know what to think of the whole situation. One thing I do know, however, is that it's extremely important for you to trust your guts and your instincts. You can easily play things off as being tired and maybe you've just been out on your own for too long, but don't. Some of this is a survival instinct that was adopted and adapted years before we existed by our ancestors, and they were there for a reason. I don't know what would have happened too if I hadn't have actually woke up in time. Most likely the base of the tower would have set fire and it would have either collapsed or trapped me in there, and I wouldn't be telling you this story today. What's worse is I'll never know exactly why these people were stalking me and tried to get me like that. I haven't really done anything wrong to anyone, and that kind of haunts me a bit, that there's truly evil like this in this world. But I can tell you one thing, I'm never going to sleep as easy as I used to, and I'm never going to go back to that part of the country again. I just can't. Just the thought of it kills me. I've not been able to go camping since, or many of the other things that I enjoy. Even if I'm with a good group of people, I still feel terrified. I really hate thinking of what would have happened if I hadn't have woken up then, but I guess I can tell you that it's not worth thinking about, and that might be a story for another day, but thankfully it's not one that I have to share with anyone. So please, whoever's listening to this story, remember, trust your instincts, and never doubt that something bad could be out there. Always be well prepared for any situation and never rule out anything. I hope nobody ever has to experience anything like this. And I thank God that this didn't happen to someone who wasn't as experienced as I was. I think if I didn't have all my training and level of fitness, I again wouldn't have made it out of there alive. Thank you for listening to my story, it helps me getting this off my chest. Now, I'd been a search and rescue worker for a few years, so I'd really seen my fair share of crazy things happening, a lot of which will stay with me forever, whether I want it to or not. But there's one thing that stayed with me for completely different reasons. So on one particular call out, about 20 years ago, I'd been called to an area that I knew very well and I had no issue actually going into. Apparently somebody in a coat had gone missing who was apparently hiking and hasn't been seen since. I get out there as quick as possible and start my search radius in the area that I've been permitted to search. Now, it wasn't actually night time, so I was glad about this. It was about midday, so I was really happy to be out there, because I knew that I had the best chance of finding somebody in the daylight. The chances of finding somebody at night are a lot worse because A, they normally don't have any way of communicating with you outside their own voice. Usually if they had anything with them like a flashlight, it's usually dead by now, and most people don't really know how to make fires. And secondly, you can see everything. So I start my search and I'm just eager to find this person. I don't have any luck for the first hour or two. I eventually make my way up to a big waypoint where I can see quite far in all directions. I decide I need to stop for a minute and drink some water because I don't want to get lost out here myself and get too disorientated. As I do so, another hiker comes up to me. He says, "Hey buddy, are you lost?" I say no, quite the opposite, and laugh. Now he's wearing a green coat, so I know it's not the person that we're looking for. And plus this person looks really young, like he's in his early 20s. The person we're looking for is in his late 40s. I say what's he doing and he doesn't tell me too much. He just says that he loves to hike and explore the outdoors and that he's really having a good time. I explain what I'm doing and he says, "Can I help?" I say sure, and we both sit down together. Now we don't really talk too much because we're really focused on the mission, but I'm actually having a really good time, and it seems like this person is really friendly, and you know what they say, 2 sets of eyes are always better than 1, so I'm sure we're gonna find this person quick. So we search for about a good hour and can't find much, but my new friend, whose name I haven't caught yet, continues saying that we should check in this area. I don't know why, but I decide to follow what he says, and we continue up ahead. He says just follow this all the way down and you'll find them. I'm convinced. I say sure, let's go, and he says, "Sorry, I have to turn back now, good luck." And with that, he disappears down the hill. I'm on job so I can't stop and talk anymore, so I continue going forwards. I realise that I still haven't caught his name, so I quickly run up the hill, and he's nowhere to be found. It's crazy, it's literally like he's vanished, but that shouldn't be possible because I can see everywhere from up here. I think this is really odd, but don't really have time to dwell on it and have to continue. I only have about 2 more hours of daylight too, so I don't really want to be lost out here on my own. So I continue on with my search. Now, I didn't think about that person again because I was too focused on my job. I just thought it was cool somebody came there to help me. Now I stopped again to drink some more water and look up ahead of me, and I can just make out a blue colour coat that matches the description perfectly. I almost spit the water out as I quickly jolt up, literally spilling all of my remaining water on the floor, quickly going over to the area. I call out and blow my whistle, but they don't move. I get a horrible feeling in my body. Just as I head over there, I can hear somebody else calling out to me. It makes me jump for a second, but then I realise it's my name. It's one of the other rescue guys. They've got to him first. He said hey, and my name. We've just found him, and unfortunately he's passed away. I then ask him to describe him to me, and it's literally perfectly to the description of who we're searching for. But suddenly something clicks in my head. The very person that's just been described to me matches identically to the one I'd met earlier, just he looks far younger. I then ask for some more information about the person they've discovered, and ask where specifically that they're from. He then tells me that he's from Quebec in Canada, and suddenly, my heart drops. The person I was talking to had a French-Canadian accent, and then I realised something. I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, but I don't have an exact reason for what happened that day being anything else. When I saw an ID match on the person they discovered, it was striking how similar it was to the person that spoke to me. I believe that that person had come back in spirit form to guide me to their body. It would literally have been impossible for anybody to be out there without being discovered by the search and rescue team, and to be able to disappear like they did. I could have just thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the fact that they appeared so suddenly and disappeared while guiding me to the exact place where the body was is absolutely crazy to me. It's one experience I've never been able to forget since. My dad had been a fire watchman for a long time, and it was never really a job that interested me too much, but some of the things he told me give me nightmares even to this day. I always told my dad a lot of it was probably his mind playing tricks on him, but he's also said other things that made me think otherwise. I want to share a few of them with you today. Now, my father said that it was during one summer that they got an unusual call out. Apparently, somebody had spotted some smoke in one area that was within my dad's region that he had to cover. He had a look in the binoculars but couldn't actually see anything, so decided to go and investigate in the general area. As my dad heads down there, he has a strange feeling that he can't shake, almost like there's some kind of impending doom. He doesn't know what it is. Just as he takes a step forward to go to the area he needs, he hears a strange howling sound. He looks over to his left, and there's a wild dog staring at him. He said it scared the life out of him until he yelled at it and it ran off. My dad said the tension was cut like a knife had gone through it, and he was completely fine now. He continues with no sign of fire, until eventually he finds a small, smouldering area. He thinks this is a little odd because it's almost like somebody's done this on purpose. There's just a single stick on fire. He's never seen anything like this before. And guess what? The feeling that he's being watched comes across again. He thinks this is weird and he picks up the stick, and there's nothing weird about it. Just he knows somebody's probably out here because it recently was on fire. He pushes it into the ground and can't seem to put it out. As he's doing that, he sees somebody throw a stone right next to him. He shouts out, "Hey, whoever's doing this, you better stop." Just as he's doing this, he stops midway through his sentence and realizes there's a note attached to the rock. Confusingly, he goes over to it and opens it up. He says the next 3 letters terrified him and he still has nightmares about it to this day. It just said run. My dad looked up and somebody has set fire to next to where his vehicle is and almost entirely around him. Needless to say, my dad didn't need any further instructions. He drops the rock and the note and immediately starts sprinting towards his truck. He manages to get in just before the fire spreads to it and speeds off to the next station. He radios in what's happened, and some of the other guys say they've had some strange reports about a group of people in the woods. My dad finally makes it to safety, and after a while they manage to put the fire out with some of the fire services and other departments. My dad files a police report of what's happened, and a few of the other watch guys file their reports of the strange men they saw. Nobody's sure exactly what happened to this day, and I thank God that my father made it out of there safely. I mean, heck, if he didn't, you wouldn't be hearing this story now. But it absolutely terrifies me to my core, thinking that not only could I have not existed, but some absolute lunatics are out there in the woods doing God knows what, trying to kill an innocent man for no reason. My dad said after that he had a long time off work and got stationed to a complete different area. He actually moved state after that, it scared him so much, but more on that another day. Now my father would also tell me about some beautiful things that they would see in the night sky. Of course there wasn't too much light where my dad was, so in the tower you could get a beautiful view of the stars usually. He said he always liked to see different galaxies and nebulas through his binoculars, and planets sometimes. He said it would only be a star, but he knew exactly what it was because he was always into astronomy, and when he was younger his father had a telescope that he loved to use. And of course, from my dad's generation, they had the whole space race and moon landing, and my dad can just about remember Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon. I wish I could have seen it. So my father tells me that there was one night in particular that something was just off. He was looking through his binoculars at stars for a few minutes when he realizes that the area around him is slightly too warm. He's not sure whether he's left the heater on, but he goes and checks and nothing's on. He thinks this is odd, and as he steps out again, he realizes the stars look different from normal. It's almost like they've moved. He's pretty sure it's just his mind playing games with him, and he's sure not a coward, so he continues searching. As he does so, something very bright appears behind him, almost like somebody's turned on a flashlight. Now initially my dad doesn't know whether it's his eyes messing up or what, but as he turns around, he can see one of the stars floating just above the tree line. He's fixated on this for what feels like an eternity, but was probably only 1 or 2 minutes. While doing so, my dad realizes that the warm sensation has come back again. Now, he also realizes that there's other lights here and they all seem to be dancing and moving around. My dad wipes his eyes and can't believe what he's seeing, and there's a strange glowing colour coming from the tree line. My dad goes to radio it in, but he can't get anything at all on his radio. It's completely dead, with just static sounds. He can hear some kind of transmission, but it's extremely fuzzy, and he can't really make out words. My dad says he doesn't know what compelled him to do this, but he has to investigate. He still can't believe what he's seeing. He grabs the binoculars and rushes down to head over there. And of course it could be the start of a fire for all he knows. He says as he's walking up towards it, the lights become completely still. And suddenly, nothing. My dad said everything slowly goes black, and all he can remember now is waking up in the early morning. He said when he woke up his face was really hurting him, and looking on a small mirror that he has on a compass in his pocket, he can see that he can't actually see which direction he's going in. The compass is just spinning in circles, and his face is sunburnt. Now this is impossible because he was completely fine the night before, but now, he looks like he's been in the sun for days. His arms are like it too, but especially his face, and it only seems to be on the front side of him. My dad doesn't know exactly what happened, but he must have been out for at least 5 hours because the sun's up now. And what's really strange is near where the trees are, it looks as though lightning struck, but there's no signs of that. The one tree that he saw that thing hovering over is completely dead. Again, not like it's been burnt from lightning, like it's dead, like it hasn't had any leaves on it for at least a year. To this day, my dad still has no idea what happened, and he said he wants to draw it up to his mind playing tricks on him, but there's just too much that doesn't add up here. My dad always loved the stars but never really believed in UFOs or aliens or anything like that, but he's now convinced that there's something out there that's not from this earth. So I used to live near an infamous road. It's a thin road with no street lines, but only a few houses at the end, and lined with thick woods. There were no street lights. We heard stories like ghosts being spotted in the woods, weird beasts and creepy vibes, and a penny throw off a bridge coming back to you. Now my boyfriend and I had decided to drive down to it in his car one night. Now my boyfriend has a manual car. The road had several pull-offs where you could park and sit. We pull off at the first one and take some footage of the woods. Nothing happened, so we continued driving to the next pull-off. We parked and shut off the car. We hear some rustling, but both assume that it's probably an animal moving away from the sound of the car. We sat there for a few seconds in the dark of the woods. We then heard something hit the car like a rock or something. We then hear several pounds on the top of the car. At this point we decide to drive off. We try and start the car, but to no avail. It stood still. I was freaking out and told him to stop messing around. He then looks at me and says I'm not. While in first gear, he then presses on the gas, beginning to pull away quickly. Against all logic, the car was fighting to go forward against something that wasn't viewable. The tail lights it up, and behind us we can see nothing. Out of nowhere, the car miraculously jumps forward, and we drive off quickly. We try and blow off the experience of not being anything, but it's pretty crazy. We eventually decided to pull off near the bridge and park up. We go to throw a penny for the true experience, and we hear it hit the stream. It doesn't come back. We then look towards the car and can actually see somebody walking towards the back of it. We rush to the car, but there's no sign of anyone. This is the last straw, and we decide to get off the road ASAP. As we're driving away, we hear something else hit the car. This time it sounds like a penny, but we can't be sure. My dad told me this story several times with the context of a weird, cool event that happened to him when he was 10 in the late 1970s, as though he was time traveling. As I got older though, the story really starts to terrify me, especially since when I was younger, I used to go to the same woods to play all the time. So his story started off with him doing normal things that some 10-year-olds might do. Going up to the family forest to play on the outskirts. Mind you, the entire area spanned over 65 acres that we own, but overall it spans miles. He said that it was a normal day and nothing out of the ordinary was happening, until he got to about halfway through the entire woods. He looked into the very far end of our area and heard multiple men's voices coming from inside. My grandfather used to be a farmer, so my dad thought that it could have been one of his uncles. Being curious, he runs over to the woods to investigate. There, he walks into the trees until he comes across an entire logging crew clearing the trees. He said that it was nothing like he's ever seen before, and these men were working and are completely ignoring him as though he's invisible, literally. The other strange thing was that all of the logging trucks and the clothing that the men were wearing appeared to be extremely outdated. He said it was probably 30 or 40 years old at least, potentially more. He starts walking through the area and then tries to ask the men where they come from and who are they. One man finally notices my dad, squats down and says, "What are you doing down here, kid? You need to go back." My dad, very confused, agrees to follow the man back to the edge of the woods. They wave goodbye and my dad starts walking back home. He says all he can remember after that is starting to walk back, but waking up in the middle of the field and the sun's now setting. He's been gone for nearly 2 hours according to his mum, who's been yelling and calling for him for literally hours to come back in, and she's getting worried now. As he normally stayed, never for that long though, she realised something was wrong. The weird thing was that he said it only felt as though he was gone for 10 minutes tops. He never took naps, or he was someone who would never normally take naps too, and that's something else that he found really weird. For some reason, he never felt the need to bring it up until he saw my grandmother. I still don't understand why he never did, and he still to this day doesn't really know that I understand either. He said when he got home, it was like he couldn't really speak at all and he was incredibly drained. As the next few days go by, he told himself that it was probably real and that his dad probably hired people to go out there or something. He said things got really weird though when he went back the following week, and it was as though the men were never there. The trees were not cut, no tyre markings, nothing. So he still didn't bring it up to his folks for some reason. Years later, as an adult in his 30s, he sat down with my grandfather one day over lunch, and somehow, getting on the topic, my dad wanted to ask him a few questions. By this point, my dad was convinced that he either had a very weird dream and really did pass out, or that he had time travelled somehow. To be honest, at this point, he did not really think of it as that strange of a dream. Now there's some questions. He asked my grandfather about the property itself. How many times has it been logged? Among other things involving logging. The biggest thing that stuck out though was that my grandfather told him that about 30 or 40 years ago, before my dad was born, his family had hired a logging company to clear and sell lumber. Nothing super eventful, but it matches almost perfectly to what he saw. Thinking back to my own childhood, there were so many times I went exploring by myself or with my dogs in the same woods. The strangest thing I can ever think of what happened to me was that I would occasionally hear men yelling construction talk, but I always thought it was my neighbours, but they were never there. It sort of sends a chill up my spine thinking about it now. I also found a barbed wire fence mashed into a tree, horseshoes, and old tools that were used for farmland, as well as interestingly shaped natural streams. There's tons of natural cave systems on our property too, which I've managed to find one where one of the streams flows into the underground. It's quite beautiful really, but there's some creepy areas that are entirely empty, dead of everything including weeds, looking as though it's been untouched for decades. When I was 8 years old, we moved to the place that I still live in today. The house lies at the end of a dirt road in a rural village. Surrounding the house are fields and scattered forest patches. Our property is not very large, just the ground directly surrounding the houses. In front of the house is an open grass field with some small tree patches here and there, as well as some higher and lower parts. It's not completely flat. After really thinking about it, it's probably more like a kilometre or so of fields that stop and start with trees in between. Now there must be in total about 4 or so times where I went to explore when I was younger, most of the times with a friend. The last time I'd been there must have been at least 4 years ago. At first glance, the trees seemed to go on for a long time, but already after 50 metres, there is a dirt ridge to the left and right around 2.5 to 2 metres higher. Then all of a sudden, if misplaced, there are a few cabins with no patterns to their positions, scattered over roughly 250 metres with a shallow pond and thick wood on the sides, and between them grass and thin bushes on either side. The whole thing had a rectangle shape. Now we had crossed over the ridge on one of the shorter sides. Now the cabins all look like they're built in the 80s with flat roofs. When we first went there we thought it was odd, but it could have just been an abandoned resort or something. But then we looked through the windows. Inside most of them, they're empty or had things covered in blankets. I remembered thinking it was creepy, but when we found animal remainders all over the land behind the ridge, we got really scared. And we went deeper into it, which was only when we were there the second time. I remembered thinking how odd it was to be there, because there were no signs or anything to mark somebody's property. There weren't any roads to go there to. Now, when we got to the end, it was the last time we went there, because it felt like we were being watched. As we went to leave, I spotted a tall hooded man in dark clothing walking towards us from about 100 meters away, with what appears to be a rifle on his back. My friend and I start running away in the direction of my house, but I can see the man following us. We reach the ridge, but our view of where the man would be is blocked by a cabin. My friend climbs over first and I followed him. We run and don't stop running until we're home again. We never told our parents or anybody else because we don't really want to get in trouble, but it was truly terrifying. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I have searched everywhere for sightings or even myths around the area we saw it, and I found nothing. If anyone has any idea what we saw, or even if anyone else has seen it, please let me know. My husband and I think it could be a Wendigo, but I'm not sure. Now, my friends and I go camping a lot. Our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We go there so often, and I've been there since I was an infant. I'm 28 now, married with a kid, and still go. It is the closest place to where I live that you can actually see the Milky Way pretty much all the time. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star every clear night that I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Our first experience is night hiking. We would go to the trails we knew well, and were used to frequenting during the day. Now, the most used trail in the area is one that's known as the Natural Bridge Trail. The trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, and after reaching the main trail, there's no lights. It's often used, and while it's an uphill one, the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends and I have literally done this multiple times, and are confident in it as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's in the woods and I've never really been to one that I've cared about closing times. When we use this main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a lot designated for the pool and Hoden Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and past the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's actually a waterfall and some lights. It's always best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you walk across another road, and there's a mini shelter to sit on, or a small rock wall that you can rest on. That night, things are normal to begin with. As soon as we started the hike, the clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing because we can't even stargaze. But we went anyway just in case it cleared out by the time we get up there. In the beginning, it was just normal paranoia that was keeping us stressed and quiet, it seemed. You know, you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant limestone wall. During this time, there was a gazebo that sat to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on top of the gazebo. We're all facing down towards the limestone wall now. We each have an LED headlamp and a headlight. We don't usually look at each other because it's blinding, so we sit in a line, like the Lord's Supper, and walk in a line or staggered not to blind ourselves. It is after hours at this point. No ski lift riders have gone for hours and the rangers had already done their sweep, so they're heading back, but we're obviously not. We ended up leaving in no time though, and making sure the trail at the top was clear for our hike up. The ski lift takes you to the top, but there are workers that stay and do counts and only leave once it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp appears, beginning to walk down the trail, staring at us. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike's uphill, and while it's easy, you don't want to do it without water or real shoes. She'd have to hike up and down to this point with no food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo down to where she comes from, she stops. And she just stands there, kind of eerie. She's looking directly down at us. Her light made my hand light up. Now she doesn't turn away from our lights at all or even react to them. I say hello. She said kind of what sounds like hello, how are you? But I can't make out what it is. I said something like, good, and you? She pauses for what feels like an eternity and says, oh, I'm fine. She then just stood there with her hands to the side of her, staring at us. Her light made it impossible to really see her face, and it was so bright I have to put my hands up the entire time. She eventually walked away and slowly turns down the trail. She got to the part where the trail turned and we saw her light just stay in that one spot for a minute, then fading. We wait for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everyone else just made it out to be as though I'm being afraid. But no one ever come after her, which is kind of funny. But she had done this hike alone, at night, and I wasn't sure why. Somehow she hasn't even been detected by any of the park rangers. We got up after a bit and started walking back to the top. It felt like it took much longer than it ever had before in the past, but we make it to the top. There's stones, and they're kind of steep and named Fat Man Squeeze. They get you over to the top of the bridge and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on the top, we hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are thicker now and it's miserably hot. We could hear voices at the same time and my husband kept checking for people. He never saw anyone. We saw a light flash, but nobody near it. And then a bird call. But it wasn't like a real bird, almost like a person imitating one. Like rhythmic and not so much natural, if that makes sense. I was convinced that we weren't alone, and hadn't been alone for a while now. I ask if we can leave as soon as possible, and everyone agrees. We began going down the way that we come from, and it felt like it was taking an eternity. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we're not making any ground it seemed. It's hard to explain, but it was weird. I even said aloud, this feels much longer than it should be, and they agree with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the sides, and my friend kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling watched and can't figure out what footsteps are ours or the others. I would turn around in the direction of a noise and see nothing. When my husband was walking, he kept saying he was catching eyes with something in his flashlight. Usually you can see a raccoon spying on you, but not this time. He's afraid maybe it's a big dog or bear. And I could never see it when he did. Now, we're hiking down semi-panicking on a kind of flattish area compared to the normal downhill areas that we're used to. The log fence or handrail or whatever it's called is on our right. We are in a row walking within reaching distance from the barrier, and my husband just stops walking altogether and says, "What's that?" But the question is more of an alert. I move my headlamp in the direction that he's pointing to and see nothing. But then, both of his lights catch a shape. My headlamp catches the shape too. It's almost simultaneous. All lights fixate on this grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, knees facing out to the right, turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand, and my mind is racing. It looks human, but it's far too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods, but this is shiny. It's thin and big, almost like it's too big and too grey. There's a shine to it, and our lights reflect it even more. It gradually comes to a standing position. Its head is long and its eyes are in a human position, but it's not human whatsoever. It doesn't have normal eyes, just big empty holes. It looks directly at us. The way it stood up was intimidating, almost like it was a snake, and it appears smart. It was like it was stepping up to a fight, from crouching to accepting a challenge. Its hands had to be by its knees. It must have stood about 8 or 9 feet tall. No hair whatsoever, and its head was large. I can't process what I saw, and I was frozen. Then, I can just feel my husband hitting me saying, "Run, please." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it pivots and runs to the right, going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and onto the trail behind us. We take off the rest of the way, running down the trail, knowing that this thing could take off so much quicker than us and get to the barrier so quick. We didn't talk much at all because we felt so scared. We kept running as far as we could. It never felt like we were even out of sight of this thing, let alone reaching distance. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the right side crashing down through the forest. We run to the road and get to the car, driving off as quick as we possibly can. When that thing looked at us, I knew immediately it was much stronger, smarter and faster than us. I knew that if we hadn't seen it, it could have taken one of us at least. I think it only hesitated because there's such a big group of us. When we made it back, we were all terrified, trying desperately to figure out what we saw, but none of us can make sense of it. I was born and raised in the hills of eastern KY, about 10 miles from Hazard. When I was about 14 to 15, my cousin and I went hiking, going to the top of one of the mountains. We followed a trail, sometimes almost straight up, and what we saw terrifies both of us. We had been walking for about an hour and a half, when we saw a man and woman's clothes on a tree limb. That might not sound strange, but we were far from people, and the branch was at least 30 feet off the ground. The clothes were neatly draped over the branch like they'd been not thrown up there. We ended up going further, and eventually found a flat area. There's no trees, no grasses or flowers. Now, off to my left, I remembered seeing a black hole in the air. Not shiny, like the mouth of a cave, just black. It was 8 foot tall and 3 feet wide, and kind of misty around the edges. Seems like every year, the memory fades a little, so the next thing I remember is tearing down the side of the mountain as quick as possible, not following the trail, just trying to get away from whatever it was. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but I'm sure there was a connection between the people's clothes missing and that. I've been lurking here for a few months, but decided to tell my story finally. My family and I are from Oakland, CA. It was 2012. I was 16 and my brother was 12, and my parents are both in their mid-50s. One summer, we were on a road trip and ended up camping in the mountains above Lander, WY. I remembered sitting in the back seat behind my dad who was driving. We're on a dirt road above Sinks Canyon. All of the windows are open. It's July and really nice out. We pulled over by the turnout to one of the lakes to the right of us to take a look at the map. My parents weren't sure about how to get to the campground on the other end. It's quite a few miles away. About this time, a young lady came jogging from the other direction. I remembered she was blonde, had a yellow tank top and dark shorts. My dad waved out the window to call to her. He said we're lost and said, "Do you know the area?" "Yeah, sure do, if you keep following this." She mentions, "It will take you to Louise Lake. The campground's to your left." We thank her and she says she's Amy. Anyway, a few years later, I see an episode of Disappeared that featured a young runner who had gone missing in the 90s outside of Lander, WY, and I immediately get chills. Apparently she was never found. They show her picture, and the hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood up. It's her, and her name's Amy. When we saw her, she appeared to be the same age, even wearing the same clothes in the program. I showed my dad a few days later, but he didn't remember specifics. He remembered her being called Amy, but that was it. My brother was asleep when this happened, and my mum had no comment. But I know what I saw. It was Amy. Now, I'm not religious, which makes this story harder for me to understand, but the rest of my family is, and for some reason, my mum and dad were still together, and they prayed when riding the bus. That was just a habit they had. We lived in Finland out in the woods a bit, and strange things aren't really that common here. This happened before I was born. I was in the womb. My mum and dad got on the bus, and noticed a tall, slim, dark thing sitting behind the driver. It's wearing all black robes. Now they can see because it's darker where the tree line is, and it almost stands out as being pitch black compared to the surroundings. To this day, they don't know if it was male or female. They sat a couple of seats behind the thing, and as usual start praying. My mum noticed the head of the thing start to shiver and jolt lightly. She didn't mind it, but the more she prayed, and the further into the forest the bus drove, that thing seemed to get more agitated. My mum shivers when she speaks about it. She has had so many nightmares about this thing. My mum started getting a weird feeling. My dad didn't care as much, he's used to weirdos, but the jolting intensifies and the long greasy hair barely holding on the top of the head starts whipping. The thing then starts growling and hissing. Suddenly, it stopped. Its head turns all the way around and stared with its soulless and dark eyes straight at my mum. A wave of panic overtook her as she started frantically pressing the stop button. They get off and my dad said, "What is it?" My mum explained the whole thing, but my dad brushes it off. Said that there's full of weird people on this bus. But here's a kicker. My mum often has visions, and they're often true. She once saved a guy from committing suicide and had a vision of his chair he was sitting on just before he jumped off a roof. She also saw his face in the vision. She knew where he was going to jump. He said afterwards that he told God that if somebody doesn't speak to him, he'll die. Back to the story. My mum saw a vision of the thing standing in front of their door, and she freaked out and refuses to go home. But my dad, in his nature, dragged my mum along and ensured her it's going to be alright, and how ridiculous the vision is. I bet you know where this is going. They got home, and sure enough, the thing was right there, right in front of their door. They freaked out, ran for their lives, and escaped into a bar calling the priest. He said that under no circumstances do they touch, or even go near that thing ever. They waited in the bar for hours and finally noticed the thing's gone. They then had the priest come and purify their house. I went out hiking into the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along, as well as my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes and snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down. I went to bed at 18:30. I messed around on my phone until 19:30, passed out, and I'm then woken up by a call by my friend. Now it's around 8:30 and I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving around outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling louder earlier, so I know that's what they were. I was sleeping with my back against the wall, and one of them idiots presses their noses in my back and sniffs me for a good few minutes. The second thing that happened was around 0300. This is a nightmare. Not sleep paralysis this time. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up, peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and child sitting outside my tent on a small rise, no more than 6 feet away. I asked who they are. The child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave now." They made a horrifying face. I was able to grab my gun. I tried to shoot them. Because it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, the trigger wouldn't budge. She then stood up and walked into the shrubs. The woman walks away until I can't see her anymore, but the child passed out from under the moonlight into the shadow of the shrub tree, and because the moonlight was falling on the other side of the tree, all I could do is watch her silhouette change shape. She'd become a gnarly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silently, she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all that I'm worth. She collides with my tent. In that instant, I'm throwing punches everywhere, and everything goes back to normal. Now, the crazy thing too is on the way back, I find there's scratch marks all over my car and on the back of my arms. I've never had anything like this before in my life. My husband and I love to go driving. We prefer road trips, but on the weekends or nights, we have nothing better to do than to go around cruising and just drive around. We prefer smooth and not busy roads. On this particular night, we are bored and decide to go cruising. We went up north to a small town, about half an hour from the city where the roads are curvy and smooth. This town is close to the mountains, and if you follow this particular path to the main street all the way up north, it starts driving up a mountain. It's about 9 PM, and there are very few cars in the road already since it's a little cute town, but we kept going north anyway from the houses and stores, and eventually to where the roads start curving uphill. We drive up for about 15 minutes more, and it's pitch black when we see some blinking lights. As we get closer, we see a truck that's on the side of the road facing us. I'm getting the chills thinking about being all the way up there in the middle of nowhere, and a stranded truck on the side of the road appears. As we slowly approach, I tell my husband it's probably best to turn back. I have a bad feeling, but at this point, we're pretty much at the truck. He pulls up next to us. We see that there's a young blonde guy, probably in his late 20s, who gets up to our window. I get such a bad vibe by this and tell my husband not to put his window down. I think he also gets a weird vibe and actually listens to me. He kinda just loudly asks what's wrong, and the guy just says something happened to his truck and he needs a hand. His phone is dead. Now my husband asks what happened, but this guy insists on showing him and to take a look. He says it's very friendly and even calls him bro, and he's glad we pulled up. My husband says, you know what, I won't be much help because I know nothing about cars, but I can call help for you. My friend knows a lot about cars. The guy's insisting and gets upset. I'm now looking back at the truck, and I thought I caught movement inside the truck. I tell my husband I think we should go. Now, he probably saw the look of fear on my face because he puts the car in reverse, but as he did, the guy is now behind our car, so my husband decides to go forward instead. We drive up for maybe 2 minutes, trying to find a place to turn around since the road is so narrow. The road turns to a dirt road, and there's a little more space on the side, so he's able to turn the car around. I am dreading going back that way now, and our phones have no signal at all. In my mind, I know this could all be someone with genuine problems, but this doesn't make sense. I cannot help the feeling in my gut. We soon reach the area where the truck had been, and there's no truck at all. We drive maybe another 5 minutes, no trace of one whatsoever, and we're sure we've passed the place that he said. We didn't drive up too far to begin with. I am both relieved and terrified that the truck's no longer there though. If it had really broke down, how did it get help working again in such a short amount of time? Calming myself down, I'm telling my husband, hey, maybe they really did get it to work. Maybe it turned on all of a sudden and they drove off. Suspicious, yeah, but not impossible. As we keep driving through, the roads begin to straighten out. We notice far off the truck with all the lights off, and park to the side again and notice movement in the truck. I say out loud, why did they turn out all the lights? I think they were thinking we're still far enough away from them, but we see 2 figures get on the other side of the truck and crouch down as if hiding. We get closer and my husband floors it. As we drive past, the 2 men get up. One of them is the guy that we had spoken to earlier, and the other's massive. With a very surprised look in their faces, one of them turns and runs behind us trying to catch us. I kept looking back, but it's so dark. Now all of a sudden, I see the headlights in their truck, and they start driving in our direction very fast. My husband keeps going, and eventually, we lose the headlights. I kept looking back the rest of the way, so scared that they're somehow still following us. Maybe they turned off their lights again and I can't see them. Anyway, after driving for a very long time back to the city, we're convinced no one's following us now. We do call the non-emergency line given a description, but we don't get the plates, so it's pretty much futile doing so, just given a description of the guys we saw. I realise all this could be rationalised, but it makes no sense why one guy was hiding and how they tried desperately to follow us. I hate the fact that they're still out there. I just pray we never encounter them again. I don't know if this is an Eastern Coast thing, but in my little town, there's a twice the ice station. Basically, you fill up water jugs and get ice bags for cheaper than you can in the grocery store. I went out a few nights ago to get some water, because hey, who wants to be drinking tap water? My husband was home, and because I'm kind of heavily pregnant, he insisted that he go instead, but I really wish that he would have done. I was out at 1 AM, and it's dark for miles in the middle of nowhere. As I get out of my car, I open the back seat to get the gallon jugs and close the door. The moment I do, a dark blue truck van pulls up behind me. I presume that they're doing the same thing as me, and I don't really think too much of it. However, alarm bells start going off, and the alarm bells start screaming at me when the slide door opens up and two large men step out. It's about a 20-foot distance between me and them, so the first thing I do is pull out my phone and start making a pretend phone call saying, "Yeah, I'm almost home." As soon as they see me answer, one guy says "crap," and they both get in there, tires literally screeching as they bolt out of there. I throw the jugs into my car, empty, and lock all the doors a million times before I broke down calling my husband. He told me to write down the make and model of the car and colour, and we'd go to the police station first thing tomorrow. Now I don't know if they targeted me because I was a woman alone in the middle of nowhere, but deep down, I know they targeted me because I was pregnant, and I don't want to think what would have happened if they got me. When I was 16, some friends and I went to an outdoor centre concert thing. We parked at the mall and took a shuttle to the venue. For perspective, the mall is a 20-minute drive from our home, and the venue's another 20 minutes away in a different direction. During the concert, I end up losing my friends in the crowd. I don't care though, as I wanted to get to the front, and I could just call them after the concert ends. Well, of course I lost my phone somewhere in the crowd of people, and don't even notice until the last show wraps up. I search the ground as the people dissipate with no luck. Reluctantly, I just hop on the bus heading back to the mall, hoping to meet them at the car. The car is gone, and I start to freak out a little, but it's 10 PM when I head to the bus station to see when the next bus is coming. Just my luck, it's a special holiday, so no buses until 10 AM. I borrow a stranger's phone and call the two numbers I know, my mum and brother. My mum doesn't answer, but my brother does. He basically gives me the suck it up talk and hangs up. So I'm alone, scared, and a little drunk in a city I don't know. I try walking but quickly give up when I realise I'm basically walking down a random highway towards God knows where. Back at the station, I'm just staring at the map when a stranger creeps up behind me. He asks me where I'm heading, and I say the truth. He is conveniently going to the same city, asking if I'd take a split to a cab. Realising this is my only option, as I said I don't have my own money, we get in the car. Turns out he has less than I do. We barely have enough to get to the heart of the city, which is a 10-minute drive from my home, but at least I know my way from there. During the drive, this guy gets progressively more creepy. He's aware that I'm 16 and he's 25. He scoots closer every minute, touching me, insisting I come back with him, even writing his number on my leg. As we get there, I realise the situation I'm in. We're about to get out at a quiet area at 2 AM, and the cabbie's gonna drive off, leaving no one to hear me scream. The second he gets out, I turn to the driver begging him to take me further, so I can at least put some distance between us. The cab driver said he hadn't heard a word the whole way, but definitely heard something odd. He asked me for my address and takes me all the way home, and the creeper stares in frustration as he drives off. When I got home, I offered to wake up my mum to pay him, but he declined, saying he's just glad I'm safe. I broke him through the kitchen window to get to bed and cried myself to sleep. I'm just glad the cab driver was so kind to me.